When I was 11, my father, my older brother, and I lived on a property just outside of a remote town in the Appalachian foothills of northern Georgia. The house was nestled at the bottom of a steep slope, surrounded by dense second-growth hardwood forest that swallowed the light the moment that the sun touched that ridge. We relied on a wood stove to heat the place through the winter, so my brother and I spent our afternoons hauling logs from the edge of the tree line. It felt like a normal life too, but looking back, there was a consistent sort of low-frequency unease to the property, is how I would describe it. It started with small, fleeting visual things. I remember one afternoon seeing a man standing about 30 meters out in the trees. His silhouette was perfect, height, build, posture, and I was so certain that it was my dad that I walked 20 yards into the brush calling his name. I turned a cluster of oaks and there was nothing. No sound of snapping twigs, no retreating footsteps, just the silence of the woods. I didn't think it was paranormal back then. I just felt like I'd lost a game of hide and seek almost. Or that maybe there was someone out there in the woods that was being a little bit creepy or whatever. Anyway, then there was the night that I saw the light. Now, let me assure you that it was not a reflection or a car on the distant logging road. It was a literal solid glowing orb, about the size of a grapefruit, hovering near my bedroom window. It didn't flicker. It bounced in a sort of stiff, rhythmic arc against the glass, almost like it was testing the pain. I ran to get my father, but by the time that we returned to the room, the light was now gone. It appeared again the following night, but after that it never returned. The environment finally broke us, though, one evening in late November. My father, a man who didn't rattle, came back inside while the sun was still up, his face completely drained of color. He told us that, as he was bucking a log, something massive had sprinted through the brush directly behind him. He hadn't seen the face, but he felt the displacement of air, and he said that whatever it was impossibly tall, towering well over 6 feet, and that it had cleared the distance with a strange, liquid speed, is how he described it. We sort of laughed it off in the end as a spooked deer, but the look in his eyes wasn't the look of a man who had seen a deer. That much was clear. 2 weeks later, my brother had his encounter. He had been stacking wood in that same clearing and returned to the house, his hands shaking so violently that he couldn't hold his cup. He told us that he had seen something standing perfectly still between 2 pines. He described it as human-shaped but drained of all color. A flat matte white, like bleached bone, is what he said. He didn't describe it as walking. He said that when it turned to retreat into the shadows, the movement was way too smooth, like a puppet being jerked back on a wire, is what he said. It didn't shift its weight, it just sort of drifted out of existence. I personally never saw the pale thing clearly, but a few nights later, I did see a flash of white move across the tree line at a speed that felt wrong for any animal that I knew of. The strangest artifact of that time, however, is a memory that I still could not place. For years, I carried the vivid memory of my brother telling me that there was an unmarked, sunken grave somewhere deep in the woods behind our shed. I must have asked him about a dozen times about it, and he'd point toward a specific ridge. But years later, when I brought it up as an adult, he looked at me with genuine confusion. He swore that he never said that he'd never seen a grave, and that he had no idea what I was talking about. Mind you, he was certainly not the type to lie, which leaves me with the unsettling thought that I either hallucinated a conversation or something had nudged that information into my head or something. We moved about a year later, and the house felt instantly hollow, as if the tension had been tied to the land rather than us. I don't believe in monsters in the cinematic sense or anything. I actually suspect that maybe we were living on a land that had been used for something else, or that there were people passing through the woods who knew how to remain unseen or something. But the consistency of those encounters, the tallness and the wrongness of the movement, way that my father and brother described a presence that they couldn't name, and the look on my father's face, it still makes the hair on my arm stand up whenever I think about it. I really don't have a conclusion. I just know that in those woods it really felt like we were never the ones who were actually in charge. In the early 1990s, I lived in a sprawling dry scrub property in regional South Australia, just outside of a small town near the Murray River. We weren't farmers, just people living on a large dusty block of land with no neighbours for miles. My father, he worked in drilling and was gone for weeks at a time, leaving my mother and me to manage the property. My father had a pragmatic, almost fatalistic view of the unexplained, really. He didn't call things ghosts, just disturbances that hang around. Everything changed when my parents' marriage disintegrated, though. I was 10 years old at the time, and the house became a vacuum of volatile energy. The court battles and the screaming matches, they were constant, and I was being shuttled back and forth between my father's isolated block and my mother's new rental house closer to Adelaide. The manifestations began at my mother's place. It was a modern, single-story home, yet I would sit in my bedroom and listen to the distinct, heavy sound of furniture being dragged across the ceiling. There was no attic, though, no crawl space, just empty joists and insulation up there. When I asked my mother about it, she would snap that it was just the roof settling, but her eyes were always wide with an unvoiced panic. Then, the physical environment started to warp. My bedroom, for instance, would drop in temperature so violently that my breath would mist in the air, only for the room to return to normal heat a minute later. But the first time that it breached the veil of a private experience was in the kitchen. My mother and two of her friends were sitting with me, pressuring me to choose sides for the custody hearing. My chest was tight and I felt like I was vibrating with anxiety at the time. Suddenly, though, every single cupboard door in the kitchen, and I mean all of them, swung open in perfect, violent unison. Then they slammed shut so hard that the timber around the hinges splintered. Before anyone could scream, a cutlery drawer slid open on its own and ejected a pile of forks and knives across the tiles. We all sat there in paralyzed silence. The atmosphere in the room felt ionized as well, like the air right before a massive lightning strike. We get those sorts of storms here in Australia a lot, so you definitely know what they feel like. Anyway, after that, the house became a bit of a staging ground, really. I would return to my room to find my heavy wooden chair moved to the center of the floor, or maybe my book stacked into precise, unnatural pillars. At night, I also heard rhythmic heavy banging inside the drywall, as if something were trapped between the studs, trying to beat its way out. The most harrowing moment? Well, that occurred when I was sitting on the bathroom floor, sobbing after a particularly cruel phone call with my father's lawyer. Above the sink, the mirror didn't just crack, it literally exploded outward, and glass showered the entire room. I wasn't scratched, thankfully. It was almost as if the mirror had just been pushed from behind, and it completely missed me. I told my father about the events at his place, expecting him to be really skeptical. But instead, he looked at me with a grim sort of knowing expression. "You're wound up and it's spilling over," he said. He didn't mean it in a psychological sense. He truly believed that my internal stress was acting as a catalyst for a physical reaction in the house. And I don't think that he was wrong. One afternoon, after another brutal legal update, I walked into my room at his house and the window pane began to rattle against the frame, despite there being no wind. A jagged crack formed down the center of the glass and my dresser physically shifted 3 inches away from the wall. My father was standing in the doorway and saw the entire thing. He didn't say a word. He just grabbed my hand and led me into the lounge room, his face set in a mask of grim resolve. Once the court proceedings finally settled though, and I moved in with my father full-time, the pressure valve, it just seemed to close. And over the course of a few months, the noises faded, the temperature normalized, and the object stopped moving. By the time that I was 13, the house was just a house again. I am in my 40s now, and I've navigated high-stress careers and personal crisis, and I've never even seen so much as a light bulb flicker out of turn. I struggle with the supernatural label. I prefer to think of it as a localized phenomenon where, for 2 years, the emotional intensity of my life became so focused that it actually manifested into the physical world. But even now, all these years later, I cannot shake the memory of those kitchen cupboards flying open, or the sound of the mirror shattering into 1,000 pieces. I don't know if it was a ghost, a psychic projection, or a tear in the fabric of the house or something, but I know that when I stopped being afraid and the conflict ended, the world stopped tearing itself apart around me. In 2017, I was working private security at a remote industrial site. It was a sort of classic middle-of-nowhere setup, vast, arid land, dirt roads that spanned hours between townships, and a radio system that was more static than signal. About 20 minutes out from our post sat an abandoned government training facility. It had been shuttered for years, but in the security community, it was a local legend. Everyone had a story about it. Lights in the windows, the sound of equipment moving, the standard rumors that you tell to pass the time on a 12-hour shift. Most of us just treated it as a joke. One night, though, the shift was dead and 3 other guys on my team convinced the supervisor to let us drive out there and scout the perimeter. We were armed with standard gear, heavy-duty torches, a handheld thermal imaging camera, expecting nothing more than a bit of local tourism. As we neared the structure, the first thing that hit us was the noise. It was a sharp mechanical screeching from inside of the ducting, like metal grinding against metal. We rationalized it as a bird trapped in the ventilation, but the sound had a sort of jagged, unnatural edge to it that instantly killed our mood. The front entrance was wide open too, and inside of the building was an absolute labyrinth of dust and debris. But as we pushed further in, the vibe shifted from haunted to, well, hostile, really. There were clear signs of a squatter, crushed beer cans, scattered food wrappers, and blackened patches on the floor where small illegal fires had clearly been set. In one assembly hall, we found a bird that had been torn apart. Not scavenged, but shredded with deliberate, messy force. One of the guys at the back of the line whispered that he'd seen a shadow move across a doorway at the far end of the hallway. He didn't say it in a sort of spooky way. He said it more in the tone of a man who had just realized that we were now trespassing on somebody else's home. We found a set of concrete stairs leading to a subterranean level. Near the stairwell, someone had scrawled "Leave" into the wall paint in a dark, thick medium that looked uncomfortably like dry blood. At that point, the adventure was over. We started heading back in a tactical line, torches tied to our chests. Halfway to the exit, one of the guys raised the thermal camera at one point. He stared at the screen, then handed it to me. At the far end of the corridor, 2 small bright hotspots were moving in tight coordination near the floor. It looked like 2 predators watching us. And just then, a deafening crack echoed from deeper in the building, like a heavy wooden beam being snapped in half. We didn't debate it. We quickly moved toward the entrance with purpose, and as we reached the threshold, a heavy ceramic tile exploded against the floor behind us. We didn't look back. We sprinted for the vehicle, and the drive back to the base was where the reality of the situation really began to fracture. Mark, one of the guys on the team, completely checked out. He went stiff, like literally stiff, staring at the dash with wide, unblinking eyes, refusing to answer when we spoke to him. When we got back to the barracks, he just sat in the truck, mumbling nonsense. While the rest of us huddled in the mess hall debating whether to report trespassing, Mark suddenly called out from the barracks room down the hall, "You don't need to worry about me." He shouldn't have been able to hear our conversation. The night got worse though. We had responded to a routine alarm at a neighbouring site, and Mark came along, acting increasingly aggressive and really erratic. During the perimeter check, he started shouting over the radio for me to freeze, insisting that somebody was standing directly behind me in the darkness. I never saw anything though. The others saw nothing too. Halfway home, Mark snapped back to reality, just completely lucid again, with apparently no memory of like the last 4 hours. The next morning, Mark complained that his room had been tossed. His mattress was overturned and his gear was scattered everywhere apparently, and when he lifted his shirt, there were 3 parallel angry red welts raking straight across his shoulder blades. We filed an official report about the trespassing, leaving out the phantom details. A few months later, we found out that the police had raided the facility and arrested a man who had been squatting in the building for months apparently. He had a history of violent assault and was known for luring people into remote areas apparently. Now, obviously we were dealing with a violent, unstable person living in our blind spot, and the psychological impact of being hunted in the dark, maybe that triggered a total breakdown on Mark or something. That's certainly possible. But the scratches, the trance, the paranoia, I don't know about all of that, especially his story about his room being tossed around. I still don't go near that ridge, and I've never seen a man lose his mind quite like that again. And honestly, I hope I never have to, ever again. I've been trying to figure out how to put this into words for a while now. I'm not after advice. In fact, the stuff that I'm about to talk about ended years ago, but it still hangs around in the back of my mind, and so I thought that I should try and get it off my chest. This was back in 2012. I was 22 at the time, living in a converted basement apartment in a quiet, older neighborhood. The place was really cheap, mostly because it had been sitting vacant for a long time, and it was a really weird setup. For instance, you had to walk through a shared laundry room to get to the main living area, and the windows were all street level, so you could literally see people's shoes walking by on the sidewalk outside. I lived alone, and for the first few months it was pretty fine. But then I started noticing that my stuff wasn't where I left it. I'm certainly not a neat freak. I keep my eyes in a bowl, my books alphabetical, and my closest door shut though. One morning, I woke up and the kitchen chairs were all pushed out, like someone had just finished a meal. A few days later, my laptop was sitting on the floor instead of the desk, even though I knew that I'd powered it down and tucked it away. I figured I was just tired or maybe sleepwalking or something. I started leaving my phone recording at night though because of this, but unfortunately I never caught anything. Then the smell started. It was like wet wool and stale cigarettes, but it would only ever hit me when I was sitting on my couch. It would be strong for maybe 10 seconds and then just sort of vanish. But the tipping point happened on a Tuesday. So I got home from work, went into the bathroom to wash my face, and stopped dead. Because there were literal wet footprints on the tile. Bare feet, small, like a child's or a very petite adult's. They led from the shower stall toward the door, and then just ended. The shower was bone dry, mind you, and I hadn't been home all day. I didn't sleep there that night. I stayed at a friend's place and came back the next morning with my landlord. We checked the vents, the crawl space, the locks, but there was nothing. He looked at me like I was losing my mind, but he let me out of the lease that afternoon, thankfully. I thought moving would fix it, to be honest. So I moved to a high-rise downtown, and it was a place that felt sterile and brand new. And for the first month, it was great. But then, I was lying in bed, middle of the afternoon one day, reading a book. The bedroom door was cracked open a little bit, and I saw a shadow pass by the gap. Not like a person walking, but more like a flicker of dark fabric almost. I got up, thinking that it was just a neighbor's kid in the hall, but when I opened the door, the hallway was completely empty. I looked down at the carpet, and there, right outside of my door, was a faint, damp smudge. It looked like somebody had stood there with wet socks. Now, it didn't escalate into anything violent or anything, but it was just a very persistent, quiet intrusion. I felt like I was being tracked almost, but not by a person. Genuinely, it felt like something was tagging along behind me, moving between the spaces where I wasn't looking. I'm in my mid-30s now, and I've moved 3 times since then. I don't deal with wet footprints or shifted furniture anymore, well, as far as I know of. But even now, when I come home and the house is really dead quiet, I always check the corners of the room before I put my keys down. It's not that I'm expecting to see something, it's just that I haven't forgot how quickly a space can stop feeling like your own. I'm hesitant to share this because I know that it sounds like one of those campfire stories, but it happened, and the memory of the weight on that roof is still stuck in my head. So, I was spending the summer with my uncle on his ranch in the high country of eastern Wyoming. It was dry, flat, and miles from the nearest paved road. The silence out there at night was pretty heavy too. No hum of traffic, no distant planes, just the sound of the wind through the dead grass. My uncle had an old rusted-out International Harvester Scout parked near the edge of the corral. It didn't run, but it was our main hangout spot. And one night, around 2 in the morning, my cousin and I were sitting in the cab, messing around with a battery-powered radio, when a thud landed on the metal roof. Now, this was not a light tap. It was a heavy, dull impact, like someone had dropped a sack of cement from a balcony. The suspension of the old truck groaned underneath this weight, and the whole chassis swayed on its tires. I looked at my cousin. He was staring straight ahead, his face completely pale white. Then we heard the sound of scratching or claws or something. They didn't sound like the click of dog nails or anything, but they scraped against the rusted metal with a slow grinding friction. Whatever it was huge. We could hear the rust buckling under its weight as it stepped across the metal, in fact. It moved from the back of the cab toward the windshield, pacing with an agonizing slowness. We didn't move. I don't think we even breathed. We were looking up through the glass at the roof hoping to see a silhouette, but the moonlight wasn't enough to cut through the dark metal. It reached the hood and then stopped. Then, with a sudden release of pressure, it just vaulted off, the front end of the truck literally lurching upward as the weight disappeared. We sat there for a heartbeat, then risked a look out the side window. And we didn't just see one. There were 4, maybe 5 of them, standing just outside of the perimeter of the moonlight. Now, I know how crazy this is going to sound, but I'm just going to say it. They were shaped like wolves, but they were wrong. They stood too high at the shoulder, and their limbs seemed far too long for their bodies. They were standing in a semicircle, facing the truck, just sort of watching it. They weren't moving like animals, though. They weren't pacing or sniffing the ground or anything. They were completely still. Their eyes didn't shine or reflect the light like a dog's would, too. They were matte, dead-looking voids. One of them took a step forward, its movement weirdly stiff. They didn't growl, they didn't make a sound, in fact. They just stood there for a minute, then turned as one, and slipped into the darkness of the ravine behind the corral, vanishing without a single snap or even a twig breaking. Upon seeing them leave, we instantly bolted. We sprinted the 50 yards to the ranch house and locked ourselves in the mudroom, shaking so hard that we struggled to lock the door back up. We didn't say a word. We just sat on the floor until the sun came up. The next morning, we walked back out to the truck. The roof, it was completely dented inward, deeply. There were localized divots where the weight had been as well, and there were these long, jagged gouges in the paintwork that went down to the bare metal. My uncle, he came out, looked at the roof, and just sort of frowned. He thought that we'd been climbing on it and messing around on it. We never told him the truth. He was a practical man, and we knew that he would just tell us that we were losing our minds and wouldn't believe us anyway. We stayed on the ranch for another 2 weeks after that, but I never went back out to that place, especially at night. And look, I've seen wolves in the wild since then, and before then even. They're beautiful, skittish animals that want nothing to do with people, really. But whatever these things were, they were definitely different. They were more deliberate in their actions and far bigger. They also almost seemed curious as well, as weird as that sounds. And the more that I've researched and thought about it over the years, well, I'm not entirely convinced that they were even animals at all. So I took a caretaker position at an old timber frame farmhouse tucked into the dense, foggy cedar forests of northern Washington a few years back. It was one of those places that felt like it was sinking into the earth, with floorboards that groaned under the weight of the humidity and a draft that seemed to flow upward from the basement rather than through the windows. I was meant to stay for the autumn while the owner was traveling. The routine, it was set in by the second week. Every night, between 1 in the morning and 2:30, the house would wake up. At first, it was subtle, the sound of silverware clinking on a ceramic plate, drifting from the galley kitchen down the hall. I'd lie in bed, rigid, waiting for the sound of the door opening or the floorboards creaking under a physical weight, but nothing ever followed. It was just the sound of a meal being prepared. I checked the house daily for weeks as well. I installed tension rods on the windows and deadbolted the heavy oak front door. I spent hours sweeping the basement, checking for holes in the insulation gaps where a stray animal could get in. But there was nothing. The house was sealed tight as far as I could tell. And yet, the kitchen sounds persisted like a recording being played on a loop. Now, one humid Tuesday, I was in the bedroom staring at the ceiling when the heavy upright piano in the parlor, which had been silent since I arrived, began to play on its own. It wasn't music, though. It was a single note, struck with enough force to make the instrument's frame vibrate. Then a second note, lower, then a sharp, jarring chord. I didn't grab a flashlight. I didn't grab a weapon. I just sort of stood there in the hallway, frozen, listening. Then there was this smell, a thick scent of like pine needles and damp earth that saturated the air in seconds. My lungs suddenly felt heavy too, and the temperature in the hallway plunged, my breath instantly frosting in the dim light. The piano stopped and a voice, not a whisper as well, but a flat conversational tone, spoke from the kitchen. It was a woman's voice, clear and uninflected, saying a name that I didn't recognize. I turned the corner into the kitchen, my heart absolutely hammering. The room, though, was empty, but the kitchen table, which I had cleared before heading to bed, was covered in a thin layer of fine damp soil. The dirt seemed fresh and dark and was still holding moisture when I touched it. I spent the next 3 hours sitting in the middle of the kitchen floor holding a kitchen knife, staring at that dirt. It just didn't make any sense. I mean, the windows were locked, the floor was solid wood, there were no tracks leading to the table in or out, but somebody must have broken in and done this. I packed my truck at sunrise and I drove until I hit the next county. I never went back to finish that contract, and I never spoke to the owner about the dirt on the table. People talk about haunted houses as if they're places that hold on to spirits, but this felt different. It felt like the house was an anchor, pulling something from the woods around it inside. I still remember that smell, the damp, rotting scent of cedar and wet earth. I've lived in apartments and houses for the last decade, and I've never heard a piano play by itself ever again, and I've never seen dirt just sort of magically appear like that. I learned one thing for certain, though. When a house starts making its own rules, the best thing to do, in my opinion, is to just leave the key on the counter and drive. In 2013, I was actually living in a suburban neighborhood on the outskirts of Fukuoka, Japan. It was a densely packed area, as you can probably imagine, the kind of place where you can hear your neighbor's television through the walls. My house sat at the end of a cul-de-sac, bordering a narrow paved concrete canal that fed into the local river. During the day, the canal was filled with stray cats and the sound of distant commuters, but at night, the whole area turned into a hollow acoustic chamber. I was 19 at the time, working late shifts at a factory, so I was usually awake until about 4 in the morning. Now, around 2 in the morning, I heard a sound coming from the canal path below my second-story window. It was a sort of wet slapping sound, almost like somebody was down there with a heavy piece of fabric, dragging it through the shallow, stagnant water. Beneath the dragging sound, though, was a low sort of guttural humming. It wasn't a melody, it was a single vibrating note that held steady for like 10 seconds, dropped and then started again. I leaned against the windowsill, looking down into the darkness of the canal. The streetlights along the path were spaced pretty far apart, leaving deep pools of shadow, and I really couldn't see anything. I assumed it must have just been a homeless person or someone cleaning up the trash or something like that. But the next night, at the same hour, the dragging sound returned. This time it didn't just stay in the canal, though. I heard it climb the concrete embankment, the wet slapping hitting the asphalt of the cul-de-sac, and it stopped directly beneath my window. I didn't turn on the light. I stayed in the dark, watching the street through a gap in my curtains. The hum began again, but it was louder now, vibrating through the frame of the house. Whatever it was, it didn't really sound human. It sort of lacked the breathy, uneven quality of a voice, and it was too mechanical, like a heavy electrical wire humming under high voltage. I waited for the sound of footsteps, maybe a cough, a car door, or anything, but none of that happened. Just that flat, vibrating hum against the base of my house. Then, the dragging sound resumed, moving toward the front door. I heard that distinct thud of something heavy, like a waterlogged backpack hitting the wood of my front entrance. And then silence. Obviously, I didn't open the door. I sat in the corner of my room with my phone until the sun started to bleach the sky. When I checked the front door the next morning, there was a smear of dark, slimy mud across the threshold. It smelled like stagnant river silt and something metallic as well, like an old coin almost, and it was really pungent. It happened 3 more times over the next month as well. Each time I tried to stay awake and ready with my phone to record, but every time that the hum began, my limbs would turn to lead. I'd be overcome by a sudden, intense lethargy that almost made it impossible to stand, let alone reach for a camera. I would drift into a hazy, sort of dreamlike state, only to snap back to full consciousness the moment that the dragging sound receded down the canal. One night, though, I caught a glimpse of something. A street lamp had been replaced, and for the first time the light hit the street properly, and through the gap in the curtains, I saw a shape at the edge of the canal embankment. It was too low to the ground to be a standing person, that much was clear, and it had a strange sort of jagged outline, like a pile of wet, oily rags draped over a frame. It didn't walk, and it sort of pulsed forward, the wet dragging sound synchronized with its movement. It paused at the base of my wall, turned its head, if you can really even call it that, which looked a lot like a knot of dark hair and tangled plastic, toward my window, and the humming rose in pitch until it was a physical pressure in my ears, and man was it painful. Then it simply slid back into the canal and just sort of vanished into the shadows. I never told my landlord about any of this. In fact, I've never really told anyone because I know how crazy this whole thing sounds. To this day, I cannot explain even what that thing was. I've lived in other cities and I've walked past canals and rivers 1,000 times since then, but I've looked all over the place for an explanation, scouring the internet, looking through libraries, you name it, but I've never found anything that resembles what I saw. I don't think that it was a person, and I don't think it was an animal either. I don't know what it was, which is why I'm here, really. Do any of you guys know what the heck this thing is? A while ago, I spent a month house-sitting in an isolated farmhouse in rural Vermont, right near the Canadian border. The property was massive too, mostly overgrown apple orchards and a few rotting outbuildings that hadn't seen a tool in like 20 years. But it was a beautiful place during the day. But at night, well, it was something different. So I was there alone for the first week, and it was mostly peaceful. Then, around the 10th night, everything about the place just sort of changed. I'd been lying in bed reading, and I'd hear this sort of like weird sound against the hardwood floor, like a whacking sound. It was coming from the hallway, it seemed, and it sounded like something heavy and soft was dragging itself along, inching forward with a sort of rhythm that defied how a person would actually move. I didn't open the door, and I just sat up, my book forgotten, watching the space under the bedroom door. The weird slapping sound stopped right outside. Then I heard a sound that didn't belong in a house. The distinct sound of fabric ripping or tearing. It went on for a minute, slow and methodical, until the door handle, which was a heavy old-fashioned lever, began to depress slowly, as if someone were hanging their entire body weight off of it. I sat there paralyzed. My breath felt like lead in my lungs, and after a moment, the handle clicked back into place and this wet sound resumed, moving back toward the kitchen. Obviously, I didn't sleep that night. I made sure that the door was locked, and I sat in the bed, waiting there until the sun came up. I checked the hallway at 6 in the morning, but there was nothing there. I convinced myself that I must have just been hearing things, like the house settling, or heck, maybe a raccoon had gotten into the wall cavities or something. My partner joined me the following weekend, though, because I'll admit that I was pretty scared to stay there. I didn't tell her about the hallway. I didn't want to ruin the trip or look like I was losing it or anything. But we spent the day fixing a fence line, and we settled in early. Around 3 in the morning, though, she woke me up. Her hand was clamped over my forearm, her grip painful. She didn't say a word, just pointed at the foot of the bed. I looked down, and at the edge of the mattress, the bed sheets were being pulled down, slowly. There was no one holding them, though, but they were just sliding down on their own, bunching up as if someone were sitting on the edge of the frame and pulling them. The weight on the mattress was unmistakable, too. The springs were depressed and the frame tilted slightly under some sort of load at the end. My partner let out a small high-pitched noise and scrambled backward, her back hitting the headboard. The second that she moved as well, the sheets snapped back into place and the weight on the bed suddenly vanished. We didn't stay to investigate. We literally threw our things together, got into the car, left the keys on the kitchen counter, and drove until we were back in Burlington. We didn't talk the entire drive, too. When we finally sat down to process it a few days later, She described the weight as feeling like a massive, dense, cold vibration, and not like a person. I couldn't explain the whacking sound from the week before, and I finally told her, and she couldn't explain why the bed had moved. I've looked into local history, thinking that maybe there was a fire or maybe an old accident at the property or something that could explain this, but I never did find anything. Obviously, I don't really know what that was, but it was weird, let me tell you. I've lived in other older buildings and newer ones since then, and I've never felt that specific weight again. Sometimes, too, when I'm lying in bed and the house gets really quiet, I find myself watching the foot of the mattress, just waiting to see if the sheets will start to slide again like they did that night. Back in 2018, I was pulling graveyard shifts as a night watch security guard at an old disused dormitory block at a technical college. The building was slated for demolition, so it was completely empty, just rows of identical hollowed-out rooms that smelled like wet dust and stale carpet. My job was pretty simple, really. Walk the halls every couple of hours, check the locks on the exterior doors, and sit in the lobby until the sun came up. It was pretty mind-numbingly boring work, but it paid for my tuition, so it was good enough for me. Now, the building had a bit of a weird layout. The rooms on the third floor were arranged in a sort of long straight line, and the hallway was lit by these flickering fluorescent strips that were on a motion timer. If you didn't move enough, the whole corridor would go black. Around 3 in the morning on a Tuesday, I was doing my rounds on the third floor, and I reached the end of the hallway and paused to check my phone. While I was standing there, I thought I heard a noise coming from the room directly behind me. It sounded a bit like somebody hitting something. I turned around expecting a squatter, but the room was empty. The door was hanging off its hinges, and the room inside was stripped bare, just bare concrete walls and exposed wiring. Then the fluorescent lights in the hallway all clicked off at once. I stood there in the pitch black, my heart doing a bit of a stutter step. I didn't reach for my flashlight immediately, but instead I just sort of listened. This noise had stopped, and in its place I heard what sounded like dry paper being crumbled. The sound of someone rubbing their hands together almost slowly and deliberately with something in it, like paper. Just a few feet in front of me, in fact. I quickly fumbled for my torch and clicked it on. The beam cut through the dust, hitting the far wall, and there was no one there. But the dust on the floor was disturbed. There were long, dragging grooves in the grit, leading away from the room and disappearing into the wall itself, as if something had just walked straight through the plaster. I'm pretty sure as well that wasn't there before. After that, I didn't finish the round. I walked as calmly as I could back to the lobby and sat there with the lights on until the relief guard showed up at 6 in the morning. I didn't say a word because I knew how it sounded. But it didn't stop there. You see, 2 nights later, I was back. I was sitting at the front desk when I saw someone standing at the top of the stairwell on the security monitor. It was a man, hunched over, looking down into the lobby. I zoomed in, but the resolution was terrible. It was just a sort of grey, grainy smudge, really. So I grabbed my heavy flashlight and marched up the stairs, yelling for them to leave the building now. I climbed 2 flights, burst onto the 3rd floor landing, and scanned the hallway, but it was empty. I stood there for a bit, sort of looking around, and at some point I looked down, and that's when I noticed on the floor the same long dragging marks were there, fresh in the dust. They started at the stairwell and ended at the door of the room where I had heard that weird sound from before. I walked to that room. The door was wide open, which I knew that I had locked previously. I shined my light inside. The room was still empty, but on the back wall, someone had written something in the thick grey layer of dust. It wasn't a word, though. It was just a sequence of jagged, vertical lines, all roughly the same length. I quit that job the next day. I didn't tell my supervisor about the room or the marks. I just told them that the isolation was really getting to me. A few weeks later as well, I was grabbing a coffee with a former student who had actually lived in that dorm years before it closed. I'll admit, too, that I selfishly invited them myself because I was fishing for details, but I didn't mention the location, just asked him if he knew the building at all. And as soon as I mentioned it, he went pale and said, "Yeah, I live there, in room 304. After a little bit more questioning, I found out that apparently he used to hear that scraping sound every night, and at the time they apparently thought that it was just the pipes. He told me that the students who lived in 304 before him had apparently been kicked out after a bit of a mental breakdown. Apparently, he spent his final weeks sort of convinced that there was a man in the wall trying to tell him how to get out or something. I don't know if I saw a ghost or if I was just sensitive to the residual static of a place that had held so much misery, but I do know that when I look at a blank wall now, I still remember those jagged lines in my head, and I still remember that really weird sound of hands rubbing together in the dark like that with a piece of paper or something. So I moved into this Victorian-era terrace in a quiet pocket of an inner city that I used to live in a couple of years back. It was the kind of place that had been renovated a dozen times by different owners. Thin walls, mismatched door handles, and a hallway that felt about 2 feet longer than it really should have been. The rent was pretty cheap for the area though, and I was just happy to have a place that wasn't a cramped share house anymore. For the first month too, the only issue was the humidity there. The house felt perpetually damp, like the walls were literally sweating. I just assumed that it was poor drainage given how close that we were to the river, but the dampness was sort of localized really. It only ever happened in the second bedroom, which I used as an office. I just assumed though that maybe the waterproofing there was done poorly or something. Anyway, it all started with the scratching. It wasn't the sound of mice in the walls too. It was a dry scraping, like someone dragging a fingernail slowly across a wooden tabletop. It always happened at 11:30 p.m., right when I'd sit down at my desk to finish up work. One Tuesday, I got frustrated with it too. I grabbed a flashlight and knelt down by the floorboards near the corner where the sound was the loudest. There was a gap in the skirting board, just big enough to stick a finger into it. I shone the light inside, and I didn't see wood or insulation or a rodent's nest or anything. Instead, I saw something black covering the back of the baseboard, and stuck to it were dozens of like small metallic-looking things that looked like old sewing pins or something. I pulled out one with a pair of tweezers, and it wasn't a pin. It was a shard of rusted steel, shaped like a hook, caked in some oily black gunk. I should have stopped there, but instead I started prying up the baseboard. Behind it, the hollow space in the wall was packed, and I mean literally packed with hundreds of these hooks. They were all linked together by a mass of like tangled human-looking hair as well. It was a dense matted lump that felt warm when I accidentally touched it, which was gross. I dropped the flashlight and backed out of the room, my skin crawling so hard that I felt like I was about to vomit after touching it. I left the board pried open and spent the rest of that night in the living room, and when I went back the next morning to seal it up again, that lump was now gone. The space behind the wall was now perfectly clean. The hooks were gone, the hair was gone, even the black film was gone, leaving the wood looking fresh and sanded, as if it had never been touched by grime. The scratching sound stopped for a week after that too, and then I started hearing it from inside of my closet. I would be lying in bed reading, and I'd hear this click of my wooden hangers being pushed aside one by one. Then the scratching, that same low deliberate dragging sound, would start against the back panel of the wardrobe. And upon hearing that, I stopped using that bedroom entirely. I moved my mattress into the living room, and I actually locked that bedroom door. But the scratching, it followed me. It moved from the bedroom to the living room walls. Every night at 11:30, the same thing. The walls would ripple, just for a second, like the plaster was soft and yielding to something on the back end. I broke the lease 3 months early, and I didn't even pack everything. I left half my books and some old clothes behind. I just couldn't bring myself to reach into the back of that closet to retrieve them. I'm living in a modern apartment block now, glass and steel with no hidden spaces and no hollow walls as far as I know. It's quiet, thankfully, and I haven't had any experience like that ever since then. I've never been the type to look for ghosts, and honestly, I still try to keep it that way. But I grew up in a place that really didn't give you much choice. This was back in 2016. I'd just taken a job as a night shift janitor at an old, disused municipal pool complex on the edge of a mid-sized town. The place had been closed to the public for years while they argued about funding for renovations and things like this. My job was basically just to walk the perimeter, check the pipes, and make sure the pumps weren't leaking in the basement. The building was mostly glass and concrete. At night, with all the power cut, it was just a series of black mirrors. The first time that I noticed something was wrong, I was mopping the locker room floor. It was pretty late, and I heard the sound of a locker door being punched shut, a metallic clang that echoed through the entire building. I grabbed my flashlight and jogged out to the main change area, and every single locker was wide open, swinging slightly on their hinges. Now, I knew for a fact that they had all been locked when I started my shift. I walked the length of the row, clicking them shut one by one, and by the time that I reached the end, the first few that I'd closed were now open again. After seeing that, I didn't stick around. I left the building, sat in my truck, had a smoke, and then went home. But it wasn't just the lockers. The pool deck itself was actually the worst. It was a massive empty bowl of cracked tile, and whenever I had to walk across it to check the deep end drainage, I'd get this heavy, prickling sensation on the back of my neck, like I was walking through a crowd of people who were all staring at me. One night, in fact, the air felt so thick that it almost felt like water. I was standing by the shallow end when I heard someone exhale. It wasn't a wind sound, too. It was the specific wet release of a lungful of air coming from right behind my ear. I whipped around, swung my torch. The beam cut through the dark and landed on the surface of the water, which was about 2 feet deep and filled with like stagnant brown sludge. There were ripples, radiating outward from the center, as if something had just broken the surface and then gone back in. But there was nothing there, just the dark water settling back into a still, oily mirror. I started checking the security monitors in the office more after that as well, and I'd watch the camera for the pool deck, and sometimes I would see a figure standing at the edge of the deep end. It sort of looked like a person, but the outline was really blurry, like it was almost vibrating or something. Every time that I looked away to grab my radio, the figure would move closer to the camera too. It never walked, it kind of glitched forward almost, frame by frame. By the time that I looked at the screen, it would be standing right in front of the lens, sort of blocking the view with a smear of grey, shapeless static. I told my supervisor about the locker room doors, and he just laughed and told me that the old building had settling issues. I never told him about anything else after that, and I quit 3 months later. I collected my final paycheck, and I was done with that place. I think that some places may just be sort of built wrong or something. They absorb the noise and the movement of the people who used them, and eventually they might start trying to replicate that activity, even when the lights go out and the doors are locked. I will never forget that place for as long as I live. I spent the winter of 2022 in a remote town in northern Maine. It was a small frame house on a dirt road that didn't get plowed very often, and the silence was almost deafening there. The house was actually built into the side of a small hill. The back wall was essentially the foundation, cold stone, and damp earth. I was there because I needed the cheap rent and the isolation as well to finish a project that I was working on. But after the first month, I stopped getting any work done. It all started with the cellar door. It had a heavy iron latch that I always kept locked with a padlock, just because the stairs down there were rotting and pretty dangerous. Every morning, I'd come out to make a coffee and find the padlock sitting on the kitchen floor, unlocked. The door would be standing wide open, letting a draft of frigid, stagnant air into the kitchen. I thought that I just forgot to lock it at first, but the lock was an absolute pain to open. You had to sort of jiggle the key just right just to get it open, and it wasn't something that you did in your sleep. Then I started finding things in the kitchen that really shouldn't have been there. I'd wake up to find horsehair strewn across the stovetop. Another time it was a pile of small, smooth river stones arranged in a perfect line on the windowsill. Mind you, the nearest river was 3 miles away at least, and the ground outside was buried under 4 feet of snow. One night in February, I was reading in the living room. It must have been about 9 o'clock or 10 or something, and the wind was howling against the eaves. I then heard something from the kitchen. I didn't turn around, I just sort of froze in my chair, staring at the television reflection in the dark window. And behind me, in the doorway to the kitchen, I swear to you that I saw a silhouette standing there. It was tall, way too tall for the doorframe, and had no distinct edges. It looked like smoke almost. It didn't move, it just sort of pulsed around, and every time that it pulsed, the air sort of got colder in the room. I slowly reached for the light switch on the lamp next to me. The second that my fingers touched the plastic, the silhouette surged forward. It didn't walk, it flowed across the room, covering the distance in the blink of an eye. The temperature dropped so quickly and it felt like I was in a freezer all of a sudden. I didn't turn the light on. I scrambled backward, tripped over the rug, and bolted out the front door into the snow. I didn't grab my coat, but it actually felt warmer outside. I then ran to my truck, and I didn't stop driving until I hit a 24-hour gas station in Holton. I never went back to that house after that. I had a friend go and get my stuff a few days later, in fact, and he told me that when he went into the kitchen, the cellar door was wide open, and apparently the entire floor was covered in snow. I'm living in a crowded apartment in Boston now, and I've learned the value of the noise of neighbors, I think. I've read the history of the area thinking that maybe this thing was something tied to the land or some folklore, but I've never really found anything. And so, what do you guys think that was? In late 2020, as I was wrapping up my final semester of college, I rented a room in an older 2-story terrace house in the suburbs. The architecture was narrow and really cramped, with paper-thin walls and floorboards that groaned under the slightest pressure. I was subletting from a couple in their 30s who worked chaotic, overlapping shifts, so I was often alone in the house for really long stretches. When I moved in, they made a joke about the place being noisy at night, chalking it up to the old copper pipes and the foundation settling. But the woman wouldn't meet my eyes when she said it. There was a genuine sort of lingering discomfort in her posture too that made the comment feel less like a joke and, well, more like a warning, really. Anyway, for the first few weeks I was fine, but then my sleep began to really disintegrate. I would wake up at 3 in the morning every single night, heart racing, feeling an oppressive sense of being watched, even in the absolute silence of the bedroom. I blamed it on the stress of finals and the isolation of living in a new suburb. Then the conversation started. It genuinely sounded like two people, one with a low resonant register, the other sharper and higher, talking in the room directly beneath me. It was muffled, like speech through a heavy blanket, and I assumed my housemates were having late-night tea or something at first, but the cadence was too repetitive and way too rhythmic. The situation became impossible to dismiss as well when the couple went interstate for a 6-week work project. Then, I knew that the house was empty. I watched them pull out of the driveway myself. Yet, on the second night of their absence, the voices started at 4 a.m. I lay in the dark, my breath hitching, thinking, there's no one here. The second that the realization solidified in my mind, the voices didn't fade too. They were sort of severed, cut off in mid-syllable. I started doing nightly sweeps, checking every window latch and back door bolt. Everything was always locked tight. The breaking point, though, really happened one evening at around 6 p.m. I was laying in my room with the lights off, nursing a migraine that was terrible. I heard the front door click open and then shut. Then came the steady, deliberate sound of footsteps on the lower floor. I assumed that a housemate had returned early. I went to open my bedroom door, but I'd locked it from the inside, so I stayed put, just listening. The footsteps, they moved to the staircase. They weren't hurried or stealthy or anything. They were pretty normal, heavy strides. They climbed the stairs and stopped right in the landing, just inches from my door. Then, the pacing began. Back and forth, back and forth. Every few paces as well, there was a distinctive dragging scuff, like the heel of a heavy boot catching the wood. I was now really weirded out and sort of terrified to open the door. Yet the rational part of my brain kept insisting that it must be somebody that I know. I phoned a friend and stayed on the line, my voice barely a whisper. As I was talking, the pacing continued, and my friend even heard it clearly through the phone and told me to get out of the house as quickly as I could. So I called the police, who instructed me to meet them at the front door, which was stupid really, but that walk down the hallway was the longest of my life. I unlocked my door and quickly stepped out into the landing. That's when I noticed that it was empty, which was weird. Genuinely, I was expecting somebody to be there, but the house was dead silent. The air felt stagnant and cold in a way that was really weird. As I started down the stairs, though, still on the phone with my friend, I suddenly lost my footing. It wasn't a trip, though. It felt like a powerful, invisible shove to the back of my knee. I tumbled down several steps, hitting the wall hard on my side. My friend heard the crash and panicked. I told them that I had just tripped, though, but I knew better. The police soon arrived and searched the property from top to bottom, but they found no one. No signs of forced entry either, and nothing disturbed in the crawl space. They offered the standard, well, it's an old house sort of excuse, but that didn't account for the rhythmic, intentional pacing that had responded to my literal presence. I moved out shortly after that, staying with a friend until my lease was up, actually. I never told my housemate the full extent of the experience. I just told them in the end that the house gave me bad dreams, and so I needed to get out of there because I wasn't sleeping much. I've lived in several places since then, and I've never heard a single footstep that wasn't my own. Looking back on it, I don't think that I was dealing with like a haunting in the traditional sense. It felt more like what they call an imprint or whatever. Sort of like a loop of activity that existed independently of me, is what I've read anyway. It had its own routine though, its own pace and its own presence for sure. I seemed to be just the intruder who had finally started paying attention to that schedule. I've only told a couple of people this because I still cannot really explain the overlap between what I experienced and what my partner at the time also heard. This was back in 2019 at my then boyfriend's family home. It was a single-story suburban house. That day, his mother was at work and we were alone in the house, and I was in his room taking a nap in the afternoon. I don't usually sleep deeply during the day, so I tend to wake up easily if there's a bit of a noise. I was lying on my side facing the wall when I started to wake up abruptly. The first thing that I noticed was the sound of the side porch screen door slamming open. Not a normal soft opening too, but the kind of forceful swing that hits the frame. It was loud enough that it immediately pulled me out of my sleep. At the time I realized that I couldn't really move too. My eyes wouldn't fully open and my body felt locked in place. I couldn't roll over or speak, and I assumed at first that it was just sleep paralysis, but what happened next is why I still don't fully dismiss it. So a few seconds after that, I heard the main front door open as well. Same type of forceful opening sound. Then I heard a male voice from the entryway say hello in a tone that sounded like someone checking if the house was occupied. At that point, I was fully alert mentally, but still physically unable to move. I remember thinking that it was either a break-in or someone entering the wrong house. Then I heard footsteps moving through the hallway. Not slow or cautious, but direct, like someone walking straight toward the bedroom. The bedroom door opened. I couldn't see anything because my eyes still wouldn't fully focus or open properly, but I could clearly hear movement right beside the bed. I genuinely thought that somebody had entered the room. Then something else happened that I still cannot place properly. There was a loud buzzing or mechanical noise right next to my ear. It wasn't like a normal external sound too. It felt like it was inside of my head and around my body at the same time. And I remember a strong vibrating sensation through my whole body when it happened. It repeated a few times, and I remember counting it mentally because I thought that something was physically happening to me, like I was being restrained or maybe shocked. By the third time, I genuinely thought that I wasn't going to be able to move again normally. And then all of a sudden, everything just stopped. The footsteps, the door sound, the noise, all of it ended at once. Immediately after that, I regained full control of my body. I sat up quickly and was fully awake within seconds. My boyfriend woke up at the same time and asked what was wrong because I apparently just sort of sat up suddenly and I was moving around a lot. I explained what I experienced, and he paused for a bit before responding. He then said that he also woke up earlier and thought that he heard both the porch door and the front door open as well. He also heard a male voice say hello from the hallway area. He assumed that it was maybe someone in the house and briefly checked his phone, but he didn't get up fully to investigate and just went back to sleep. He didn't hear the footsteps going into the room or the other sounds that I experienced. But the important overlap is that we both independently registered the same entry event, doors opening and a male voice saying hello. After that, nothing else happened that night, thankfully, and the rest of the stay at the house was normal. It's never happened again before or since then, and I don't have any history of sleep-related hallucinations or anything like that. I'm not claiming anything specific about what it actually was. I just know that from my perspective, it felt like a continuous sequence from waking to hearing someone enter to being physically unable to move while additional sensations happened, and then stopping abruptly once it ended. I still don't have a clear explanation for why both of us heard the initial part of it the same way and not the latter part. I'm posting this because it's been about 7 years now, and my buddy and I, we still cannot look at a map of Nevada without at least bringing up that night. We've tried to come up with every logical, real-world explanation for what we saw on that dirt road, but the math, it just never really adds up. This was back in the summer of 2019. My friend Liam and I were doing a massive road trip after college graduation, driving an old beat-up through the southwest. We were heading up from Las Vegas toward Great Basin National Park, taking one of those empty 2-lane state routes that cuts straight through the high desert there. It was about 1 in the morning, I would say, Pitch black, and we hadn't seen another set of headlights for at least 45 minutes. Suddenly, though, the dashboard GPS unit completely lost its mind. The screen started spinning in circles, recalculating over and over again, and then the map completely glitched out, showing our vehicle location floating in the middle of a blank grey void miles away from the highway. We didn't want to miss our turnoff in the dark, so Liam pulled over into a wide gravel turnout so that we could look at a paper atlas and also check our phone signals. Outside the car windows, there was really nothing but sagebrush, freezing desert air, and absolute blackness. And while I was trying to get my phone to load a digital map, Liam stopped what he was doing and just sort of stared out the passenger side window. He nudged my arm and pointed out into the brush, maybe 50 yards off the shoulder of the road. There was a massive, pulsing orange glow coming right off the desert floor. At first glance, I assumed it was a standard bonfire or maybe some ranchers camping out or something, but as my eyes adjusted to the dark, the scale of the thing became totally wrong. The fire was absolutely huge, a massive roaring pit of open flames, and it lit up a giant section of the flats. Parked in a tight uniform circle directly around the fire were at least 5 or 6 different vehicles. We cracked our car doors open and stepped out onto the gravel, using the frame of the vehicle as a shield, just trying to make out what we were looking at first. The silence of the desert was broken by this low, bassy, heavy rumble of engines idling. 2 of the vehicles in the circle, what looked like an old Ford pickup and a full-sized cargo van, were completely engulfed in flames. It wasn't an accidental engine fire as well. I mean, the entire cabins were fully roaring with ignition, shooting sparks at least 20 feet into the night sky. Right next to them, 2 massive semi-trucks with blank white trailers were idling in the dirt, completely dark. There had to be 30 or 40 people moving around that fire at least. Most of them, I think, were men, standing in tight, silent clusters, or walking back and forth between the trucks with this strange, hyper-focused energy. There was a lot of movement, but from what I could see, I don't think that I saw anyone drinking. Nobody was talking normally as well, and there was no music. It just had this incredibly heavy, tense atmosphere about it. Like a massive industrial accident was currently in progress and everyone was panicking, sort of in slow motion. Then I noticed 3 or 4 women near the edge of the flames. They were covered in thick, dark dirt or mud from head to toe, and they were moving in this erratic, disjointed way, stumbling around, dropping to their knees and dragging themselves through the sand. It didn't look like a party or a drug trip. It looked completely agonizing and chaotic to watch. Honestly, my first reaction wasn't even terror. It was just pure stupid curiosity. It almost looked like some kind of a remote trucking convoy disaster, and I actually muttered to Liam that we should walk down the ditch a bit to see if anyone needed some help. Liam grabbed the collar of my shirt and pulled me back toward the seat, though, and then he said, "Look at those trucks. That's not an accident, man." He was right. The longer that we stared, the worse that it got. The vehicles, they weren't crashed or piled up. They had been deliberately, meticulously parked in a perfect geometric circle around the burn pit, blockading it from view from the main road. Right as that realization set in as well, the energy down by the fire shifted instantly. 2 men standing by the burning pickup suddenly stopped what they were doing and whipped their heads directly toward our turnout. We couldn't hear what triggered it over the roar of the flames, but one of them pointed a flashlight right up the hill, the beam cutting through the sagebrush just short of our bumper. A second later, a loud, raged shouting tore across the flat ground. It wasn't a warning. It was frantic and aggressive. It was an alarm call for sure. We didn't wait around to see who was yelling. We dove into the vehicle, Liam slammed the shifter into reverse, and he cut a hard, screaming U-turn in the gravel to get us back onto the asphalt. As the headlights swept across the edges of the turnout during the turn, the beams, they illuminated the ground right next to where we were standing. The shock of the fire clearly had kept us from noticing it earlier, but the entire perimeter of the dirt turnout was covered in bizarre structured markings. Someone had dug dozens of small perfect circles in the dirt, spacing them about 2 feet apart along the shoulder of the road. And inside every single dirt circle, an object had been deliberately placed. I caught glimpses of knotted strips of heavy white cloth, rusted metal containers, and chunks of raw meat or bone sitting in the center of the rings, forming what looked like a physical boundary line right between the highway and that burn pit. Whatever that was, Liam didn't care. He stomped on the gas and we tore down the highway at 80 miles an hour at least, keeping our eyes glued at the rearview mirror the whole time. For the first 5 miles, we could still see the orange glow pulsating against the low desert clouds, and we both sat in the car in absolute dead silence, panicking and not knowing what to do or say. When we finally hit a town with a gas station, we tried to talk ourselves down a bit. We reasoned that it must have been an illegal smuggling operation or a cartel drop-off along the remote trails there, or some kind of a violent insurance fraud scheme where truckers burn their rigs in the middle of nowhere. Something like that, right? But a drug deal or an insurance scam doesn't involve women covered in dirt dragging themselves through the sand like that, and it definitely doesn't involve someone taking the time to dig perfect geometric dirt circles and arrange artifacts along the highway shoulder to make a border of sorts. We never did report it to the state troopers, because, we were 20-year-old out-of-state kids. We had no cell service when it happened to begin with anyway, and we couldn't even point to a specific mile marker on the map even if we tried. It was just a nameless stretch of dirt off of Highway 93 is all I can tell you. The part that still gives me the most chills is thinking about how fast those men alerted the rest of the group the second that our car doors opened. Genuinely, I think we got out of there just in time. This happened mid-2023, and I still double-check my windows every night now, which I never used to do. I didn't think that it was that serious at the time either until I told a few people, and they basically said that I got lucky. So, at the time I was living alone in a small apartment, kind of one of those older complexes where each building has 6 to 8 apartments and they face each other across a narrow walkway. Mine was upstairs, and those stairs to get up there were right next to my front door. Directly across from me was another apartment with the exact same layout, so if anyone stood on either side of the stairs, they could literally see into the other person's place if the blinds weren't fully shut. Now, I'd been there for about 8 months by this point. I also had a cat, and because it got hot there, I would leave one of those windows cracked open, just a little bit at night so that air could move through. Not wide open or anything, but just enough for a bit of airflow. The blinds were also always down, but there was enough of a gap there that you could technically see in if you really tried, I suppose. But anyway, one Friday night, my boyfriend at the time, his name was Jake, came over, and we were just sort of hanging out, watching stuff on his laptop. Nothing crazy. But at around 10-ish, my cat starts really acting off. Not playful and not zoomies, but just really tense. Tail puffed up, pacing between the bedroom and the living room, and stopping and staring at the window like something was there. I didn't think much of it at first. Cats do weird stuff, right? But it didn't stop, and 20 or 30 minutes straight, it just kept happening. I got up to grab a drink, and when I opened the fridge, which is directly across from the window, I get that random intrusive thought imagine someone standing there looking at you. How creepy would that be? I don't even know why I thought that, but I looked, and to my absolute horror, there actually was someone there. Not like a shadow, or maybe it was something, but It was a guy's face, close, way too close, and he was positioned on the stairs outside of that perfect angle to look through the small gap in my blinds. We made eye contact for maybe a second. I slammed the fridge shut and went straight to the bedroom and told Jake. I didn't even explain it properly too, just said, "There's someone outside looking in," when he went straight out to the living room and pulled the blinds up. The guy was already moving down the stairs. Jake opened the front door and stepped out, but by the time that he got to the railing, the guy was gone. No running sounds, nothing. He was just gone by then. We both sort of stood there for a bit trying to figure out if we'd overreacted, but there was no way. I mean, we both saw him. We shut every window, locked everything, and stayed up for a while after that. After that too, things went quiet. No more noises and nothing else that night. I didn't call the police in the end. Honestly, I probably should have, but I convinced myself that it was just some random creep and that he wouldn't be coming back. The next day, I go to work like normal. I get home at around 5 p.m. and it's still light out. I feel a bit uneasy, but I try to ignore it. My cat's been inside all day as well, so I go to open the bedroom window again just for a bit. And that's when I notice that the fly screen is gone. Not damaged and not loose, but completely removed. I checked the ground outside, thinking that maybe the wind knocked it off or something like that, but there was nothing there, and I know that it was there the night before because I opened that same window myself. That's when it clicked that whoever was looking in had probably been around longer than just that one moment. I called Jake straight away, then my sister, and both told me to call the police, so I finally did. Jake came over again, and we went to the unit across from mine because we'd seen that they had one of those doorbell cameras. Turns out that they actually had some footage, but not of him taking the screen. What they did have was a video from the night before of the same guy standing outside, first near their door, then moving across to my building and positioning himself on the stairs to look into my place. The timestamps lined up exactly with when my cat started acting weird too. The police came, took a report, looked at the footage, but basically said that unless he comes back or gets caught doing something more serious, then there's really not much that they could do. They told me to install cameras and to make sure everything stays locked. But here's the part that made it worse. So while we were talking to the neighbor, they casually mentioned that they'd seen the same guy a couple of times before doing the same thing to other units. Not breaking in, but just watching through the windows. So in other words, this wasn't random. I stayed there for another couple of months after that, but that changed everything for me. I locked windows, added cheap cameras, stopped leaving any gaps in the blinds. Thankfully, nothing else happened there after that, but I never did feel normal there again. I moved out as soon as my lease ended. Like I said, I never saw the guy again, but the fact that he knew exactly where to stand to see inside and had already taken the screen off of my bedroom window, that's what really gets me. He wasn't just passing by. He was deliberately testing just how far he could go. This happened back in 2011. I think it was spring when it happened. And it is the single most terrifying 5 minutes of my entire life. I don't talk about it with my family anymore because my mum still gets visibly shaken if the subject even drifts towards that weekend. So, I was 11 years old, spending the weekend at my cousin's place in a dense working-class suburb just outside of Leeds, England. It was one of those sprawling council estates where every single block looks identical. Rows of grey pebble-dashed terrace houses, tiny concrete front yards, and narrow alleyways cutting between the properties. My cousin's house sat straight at the edge of the estate, backing onto a paved canal towpath. Beyond the canal was just a massive expanse of abandoned industrial wasteland, really. Overgrown mounds of gravel, rusted iron frames, and dense pockets of gorse bushes stretching out toward the train tracks. About a 2-minute walk from her kitchen door, squeezed into a gap between two dead-end streets, was a tiny community playground. It was incredibly depressing. Just a rusted swing set, a metal slide, and a concrete basketball hoop with no net. The entrance to it was completely hidden from the main road as well, accessible only by a narrow, muddy alleyway between two brick gable walls. So, it was a chilly Saturday afternoon. The group of us consisted of me, my 11-year-old cousin Maya, her 14-year-old brother, Leo, and a younger neighborhood kid from next door named Toby, who was maybe 6 years old. Maya's dad dropped us off at the corner and told us to stay within eyesight of the houses, which was totally standard back then. Nobody worried about kids playing outside, really. We had been kicking a deflated football around for about 20 minutes, I would say, and because I was the oldest girl, I was naturally keeping an eye on the surroundings all the time. I was standing near the back chain-link fence that separated the swings from the canal path, while Leo and the younger kids were closer to the alley entrance. A few delivery vans and local cars passed the end of the alley, which was pretty normal. But after a few minutes, a massive older model white transit van drove past the gap. Oddly too, it had completely blacked out rear windows, no company logos, and a heavily dented side panel. It didn't just drive by as well, it crawled past at a literal walking pace, engine barely ticking over. I noticed it because the driver was sitting incredibly low in the seat, but I just figured that he was looking for a house number or something. 2 minutes later, though, the exact same van coasted past the alley gap from the opposite direction. This time it slowed down in a near total crawl right in front of the opening. The passenger side windows were rolled down an inch, and I could see the distinct shape of a head turning to look down the alleyway toward the playground. My stomach did a weird sort of cold flip all of a sudden. I stopped chasing the ball and just stared at the street. Another minute went by. We went back to playing, but my eyes were now glued to that brick gap. Suddenly, the white van didn't just drive past. It cut a hard, aggressive turn and pulled up directly across the mouth of the alleyway, completely blockading the entrance. The diesel engine idled with a loud, violent rattle. The heavy sliding side door slammed open. 3 men stepped out onto the pavement. They were all wearing oversized dark hoodies, baseball caps pulled low, and one of them had a bright, high-visibility construction vest thrown over his sweatshirt. The guy in the high-vis vest, he had a thick black neck gaiter pulled all the way up over his nose and mouth. On a cold, dusty construction site, you wouldn't look twice. In a completely empty suburban alleyway leading to a children's playground, it looked entirely wrong. They didn't look around to check their phones or stretch their legs or anything. The man in the high-vis vest stopped in the alleyway first, raised a gloved hand, and pointed his index finger in a dead straight line directly at Toby, the 6-year-old. I couldn't hear the exact words over the rumble of the van, but he muttered something short and sharp to the 2 men behind him, his head snapping down toward us. Then they started moving down the alleyway. They weren't running yet, but it wasn't a casual walk. It was a synchronized, wide-strided march, their boots heavy against the asphalt. They were moving with absolute terrifying intent. In that exact moment, my brain completely bypassed logic and went straight into pure primal survival mode. Maya completely froze, her eyes wide, clinging to the swing chain. Toby just stood there, holding the football, looking totally confused. But Leo, thank God for his age, instantly reacted. He grabbed Toby by the hood of his coat, violently yanked him backward, and screamed at the top of his lungs, "Run!" The second that Leo screamed, the man in the high-vis vest broke into a dead sprint down the alleyway toward them. The entire scene erupted into pure panic. I didn't even look to see where my cousin or Leo went. I was already at the back fence. I scrambled under a loose section of the chain link wire, tore across the concrete canal path, and threw myself headfirst into the abandoned wasteland on the other side. It wasn't a manicured park by any means. It was a dense, hostile field of waist-high wild mustard weeds, stinging nettles, and thick briar patches. I didn't care about the thorns slicing my shins, though. I dropped flat onto my stomach in a deep, muddy ditch between two overgrown dirt mounds, pulling my dark jacket over my head and pressing my face directly into the wet earth. Within 5 seconds, I heard the heavy, rhythmic thud of combat boots hitting the gravel canal path just 20 feet from my head. There was definitely more than one person there. I held my breath until my lungs felt like they were about to burst, but above the sound of the wind, I heard a rough, breathy adult voice growl. "She went through the fence. Check the bushes." Another voice, further down the path, shouted back, "Nah, forget it. The older lad went into the estate. We gotta get out of here." I lay frozen in that mud for what felt like 3 hours after that, but in reality it was probably maybe 90 seconds. I heard the boots sprint back across the canal path, followed by the distant echoing screech of tires spinning on asphalt as the van tore away from the estate. I was too afraid to go back through the playground entrance in case they were waiting on a parallel street, so I dragged myself through the briars along the back boundary line of the houses. I found a section where a wooded, sort of garden fence had a missing slat, jammed my feet into the timber, and hoisted my 11-year-old self over the top, tumbling into a stranger's vegetable patch. I didn't stop to explain. I sprinted down their side driveway and out into the main street. Leo, Maya, and little Toby, they were already huddling near a brick bus shelter 2 doors down from my uncle's house. Toby was crying hysterically, his football abandoned. Leo was hyperventilating so hard that he was nearly throwing up, his face entirely drained of color. We didn't say a word to each other. We just ran inside, locked the kitchen door, and threw the deadbolts. When my aunt and uncle came home later, we were so traumatized and overwhelmed that we completely botched the explanation at first. We just said that some scary older guys chased us out of the park, and because there were always local teenagers causing trouble on the estate, my uncle just assumed that it was antisocial behavior, yelled at us for crossing the canal path, and told us to stay out of the park for the rest of the weekend. We never told them about the van or the pointing. But later that night, while we were lying awake in the guest bedroom, Leo told me a detail that still bothers me. He said that the exact moment that the man in the high-vis vest started sprinting down the alley, he watched him reach into his front hoodie pocket and pull out a thick roll of silver duct tape or something. That was the reason that Leo didn't freeze, and that's the reason why he grabbed the little kids and ran. We never went back to that playground, and my uncle moved the family out of the estate a year later. Looking back as an adult, I know exactly what that was. It wasn't a neighborhood prank, and it was not a scare tactic. It wasn't a misunderstanding either. It was a highly organized, targeted attempt by 3 grown men to snatch a child from a hidden park. And the speed at which that afternoon devolved from a normal Saturday into a complete nightmare is something that I will never forget. In 2021, I was living in a quiet suburb with my partner. We had a small tight-knit group of friends that we'd seen pretty much every weekend for years. One of these people was a man called Simon. He was the definition of harmless, quiet, socially awkward, and someone that we included at barbecues because, well, he was lonely and we were trying to be nice. He never gave off a predatory vibe or anything like that. In fact, if anything, you just sort of felt a bit sorry for him. So one night, Simon gave my partner a USB drive, claiming that it was filled with indie playlists for our up-and-coming road trip. But we used it for months, plugging it into our car's head unit without a second thought. The ghost in our house as well didn't manifest in shadows or fog or anything. Instead, it manifested when we decided to clear the drive for new files. So when my partner plugged it into his laptop, he noticed the storage was nearly full, despite the drive containing only a few dozen MP3s. He dug into the system settings and he found a hidden directory that didn't appear in the main file browser. Inside were hundreds of image files. At first, too, they looked like random internet screenshots of local news anchors, random women from public social media profiles, and street view captures. But then, the realization hit us like a physical blow. The subjects were our friends, people from our group chats, and then there was also me. Some of the photos had been crudely edited with drawing software, zoomed in on specific features or distorted in ways that felt deeply sickening. But the second folder, that was what broke me. These were not internet downloads, they were original photo files. They were of me and a few other women in our circle. Some were taken in public, sitting at a cafe, walking into a shop, angles that meant that we were definitely being tracked. Then, the images shifted to the private. They were photos of me from outside of our house, but through our bedroom window. There were dozens of them too, spanning weeks, showing me in different sleepwear, proving that this had been going on for a long time. In one, a blanket had been peeled back just enough to see what was underneath, if you catch my drift. In another, his hand was visible in the frame. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding, trying to remember if I had ever seen anything, but I hadn't. Suddenly, though, the coincidences of the past year were not coincidences anymore. My handbag had vanished from my car without a trace one day, the crunching of gravel outside of my bathroom window while my partner was at work at one point, the feeling of being watched when I was home alone sometimes. It was all a pattern. When we confronted him through text, he didn't even deny it. He sent a detached, pathetic message claiming that he was in a dark place and had become obsessed. He framed it like a tragedy that had happened to him, rather than a violation of our privacy and safety. What hurt as much as the breach, though, was the reaction of my partner at the time. While he was disturbed, he lacked the immediate, absolute urge to burn the bridge. He treated it like a boundary issue rather than a violent violation. When we eventually broke up, I discovered that they had been in intermittent contact, a betrayal that made me feel like I was losing my grip on reality at the time. I did report it to the authorities, but by then the evidence was gone, and so there really wasn't much that they could do. There was no legal traction for anything, and I never really got closure on the whole thing. I never found out if he was doing this to others or if it was just us, but I don't host casual get-togethers anymore. I also take things like hearing people walking outside on the gravel way more seriously these days. And I guess the scariest part that has bothered me all these years is that it was the person that I'd been eating dinner with for years that was the phantom in my own home, hiding right there in plain sight. In late 2022, I was working at a 24-hour service gas station in a quiet, sprawling town in a pretty rural area. The shifts were long, the routine was pretty mind-numbing, and because we were a small team, we relied on our gut instincts to keep the place pretty secure. That's when a man in his mid-40s started showing up. At first, he was just another regular face, but the dynamic shifted pretty quickly. He didn't come in to buy fuel or snacks. He walked in, stood by the entrance, and scanned the floor until he locked eyes with me. If I was on duty, he would loiter for an hour, and if I wasn't, he would turn around and just walk straight out again. At first, the interactions were just bizarre, but normal enough to just sort of brush them off, I guess. Questions about my name tag, comments on my appearance, or odd inquiries about whether I was actually working there. I treated it like any other retail creepiness. Keep the conversation short, keep moving, and don't engage. But he became a fixture. He started following me down the aisles while I was restocking, standing just a few inches behind me to ask repetitive, pointless questions. I started ducking into the staff-only office whenever he pulled into the lot. Then came the sinking realization. I had seen him before. About a year earlier, I had worked at a different store in a neighboring town, and he had been a regular there too. This wasn't a coincidence. It was a pattern. A few days later, a co-worker pulled me aside. She had been reviewing the security footage for an inventory discrepancy and found something that made my blood run cold. She showed me a clip of him behind the hot food counter. He was moving with purpose, opening cupboards, sliding out trays, and scanning the under-counter storage, as if he were a shift supervisor. He had no uniform, no business being there, but he acted like he owned the place. He only left when a customer walked up to the register at one point. He wasn't just a creep, too. It seemed like he was practicing for something. He was playing staff to see how much access that he could get before being questioned. We started monitoring him obsessively on the cameras after this. The routine was always the same. Pick up a bottle, put it down, pace the aisle, and lean around the positions to watch me work. He'd stand by the cold drink fridges for 10-15 minutes at a time, never making a purchase, just tracking my movements like a predator mapping a territory. I stopped talking to him entirely after that. I gave him zero acknowledgement. It only made him more aggressive in his observations, though. He began standing near the glass partition, leaning his head just far enough to keep me in his line of sight all the time. My co-workers were terrified. One of them told me that a girl who had worked 3 months prior had been handed a note by him, apparently, while she was in the staff-only area, which meant that he'd been slipping behind the counter long before even I arrived. We finally forced management to stop treating him as a quirky regular and started the process for a formal ban. While we waited for the paperwork, I ran his name through the public databases, and it wasn't just creepy. Apparently, this guy had a violent history, older documented charges of assault that had been scrubbed from his current presence but were very real. He wasn't a lost soul after all. He was dangerous. The tension broke 2 weeks later when the police arrived at the gas station. He'd been picked up after an incident at a different station, 40 miles away, and he'd done the exact same thing. Loitering, watching the staff, and wandering into staff-only zones until he was confronted by an employee. When they challenged him, he actually attacked them as well. The victim ended up in the hospital, and he ended up in custody. The police confirmed our fears too. He was working up to an escalation point, apparently. The pretending to be the staff, the pacing, the constant watching. He was testing the boundaries, seeing how much control he could exert before he finally snapped. Management finally issued the ban and handed over months of footage to the police, but I couldn't go back after that. Every time the bell above the door chimed, my heart would jump into my throat, expecting to see him standing by the fridges. And so I quit shortly afterward. It taught me the hardest lesson in life, though. Never prioritize being polite over your own safety. If your gut tells you that somebody is mapping you, then trust it. You're not overreacting. You're reading a clear warning. In the summer of 2021, I was back in my hometown in the north of England for university break, working late night shifts at a pub in the city centre. One Tuesday, I finished a trial shift just after 1 in the morning and started the familiar bike ride home. The route was a standard quiet stretch of Victorian terraced housing, illuminated only by intermittent flickering streetlights and the harsh, buzzing glow of a 24-hour convenience store at the top of the hill. I was crawling up the incline, my legs burning, when a sound drifted out from the darkness of a front garden hedge to my left. It was a forced, jagged whisper. "Help! Knife!" I kept pedaling for 10 seconds, my brain frantically trying to rationalize it as a prank or a misunderstanding. But the image of someone being in actual danger overrode my fear. I stopped dead in the middle of the road and I looked back. A woman was peeling herself out of the thick private hedge. She was shaking, her face pale and flushed with adrenaline. She rushed toward me in the middle of the street, keeping her voice low and frantic, telling me that a man was nearby and that he had a weapon. I pulled out my phone and dialed the police, keeping it on speaker. She stayed pressed right against my shoulder as if the physical contact was the only thing keeping her from collapsing. She told me that she'd been sitting near the convenience store for a smoke when a man approached her. He hadn't started with threats, he had started with a helpful, overly familiar demeanor, asking if she was okay and feigning concern. When she tried to walk away, he had insisted on showing her a shortcut through a dense, unlit parkland area behind the shops. When she refused, his tone had flipped instantly. He told her that he had a knife and that she was going to go with him whether she wanted to or not. She had thrown her bag at him, sprinted into the darkness, and drove into the first garden hedge that she had found. We stood there in the center of the road, scanning the dark gaps between the terraced houses, feeling the heavy, suffocating silence of a neighborhood that was fully asleep and completely unreachable. It didn't feel quiet. It felt like we were being hunted almost. The police arrived in under 6 minutes, thankfully. They separated us, took our statements, and swept the surrounding alleys and the parkland path. They didn't find anyone, but they were grim and thorough. My dad drove over to pick me up and my bike as well, and I didn't return to the route after dark for the rest of the summer after that. Months later, though, the pieces sort of clicked into place during a conversation with a local acquaintance. A man had been arrested in the neighborhood borough after a string of violent attacks. He had a specific modus operandi as well. He would pose as a good Samaritan or a helpful local worker to isolate people walking home late at night. He had a history of escalating violence, including a murder charge from years prior that had gone largely unreported in our specific area. He was finally caught after an attack that mirrored the woman's story almost perfectly as well. The feigned kindness, the insistence on a shortcut to a secluded area, and the sudden shift to lethal intent. I cannot confirm with 100% certainty that it was the same man, but the timeline and the tactics are pretty much identical. Which also means that if that woman hadn't have trusted her gut and fought back, and if I hadn't have made the choice to stop and turn around, the shortcut that he had offered probably would have been the last thing that she ever saw. I still ride that road during the day, but at night, the silence there now feels less like peace and much more like a warning. In 2018, my partner and I relocated to a small weatherboard rental just outside of a coastal town. We were looking for a quieter life, and the rent was impossibly cheap for a house so close to the water. It seemed like a fresh start. For the first few months, everything was pretty unremarkable. But then we started noticing the architectural details. Every single bedroom door and even the bathroom door had heavy exterior-facing key locks installed on the hallway side. The main bedroom even had a sliding deadbolt bolted to the outer frame. Then there were the windows. Someone had clearly taken a knife or a drill or something like that to the old-fashioned blinds. There were small, rough cut holes punched through the fabric, positioned at exact eye level for a seated person. Whether you were on the couch or lying in the master bed, you were being watched from the outside, it felt like. We laughed it off as the quirks of a paranoid former tenant, until we started chatting with the neighbors. An older man next door eventually opened up about the previous resident. He didn't use names, just bad news. He spoke of constant, guttural screaming coming from the house at all hours, the kind of noise that didn't sound like normal argument. was a dilapidated garden shed out back that was a health hazard, filled with filth where the guy had kept a dog chained up for months until the neighbors finally called the rangers to have it removed. When we mentioned the locks on the doors, the neighbor just went quiet. He didn't look surprised. He looked tired, if anything. The reality of the house, though, crashed down on us one Saturday afternoon. My partner had ducked out to the local shops, leaving the inner door open but the screen door latched. I was in the bedroom when I heard a car pull into the driveway. Expecting my partner, I didn't think much of it until I heard the engine stay running. I glanced out the window and saw a black sedan with heavy window tinting. Not our car. It sat there, idling, then abruptly reversed and pulled into the second driveway on the side of the house. A man climbed out. He was massive, moving with a singular aggressive focus. He walked straight up the steps and, without a single knock, yanked the screen door open and stepped into the living room. He began shouting in a language that I didn't recognize, his voice booming and volatile. I was paralyzed, then hit with a surge of pure fight-or-flight adrenaline. I began screaming at him to get out, my voice cracking with panic. He switched to English, his frustration mounting as he demanded to know where he was, a name that I didn't recognize. He kept pressing me for the whereabouts of my partner, his eyes darting around the room as if he was looking for someone hiding in the kitchen. Then he stopped. He looked at me, really looked at me, and his demeanor shifted from rage to confusion. He asked, slowly, how long we had been living there. When I told him that it had been a few months, the fight just drained out of him. He muttered an apology and walked out of the house as quickly as he had entered. I was shaking so violently that I could barely unlock my phone to call my partner. As he pulled into the street, he saw the sedan turning a corner. Being reckless, he followed the car and pulled up alongside of it. The man was calm now, telling my partner that the previous tenant owed him a significant amount of money and had been dodging him for a year now. He had visited the house so many times while the previous guy lived there that he assumed that nothing had changed. It was a terrifying, hollow apology, but over the next year, the legacy of the house continued. Other people showed up, some asking for the same man, some just knocking and trying the door handle when we didn't answer quickly enough. It was clear that the previous tenant hadn't just been a bad neighbor. He had definitely been involved in something systematic and dangerous. We stayed longer than we probably should have for financial reasons, but we turned that house into a bunker eventually. We installed high-definition cameras, replaced every lock, and never left a door unbolted, even if we were just in the backyard. We eventually moved on, but I still think about that afternoon. That man walked into our home ready for violence, and it was only by a stroke of luck that he realized that he was in the wrong place before anyone was hurt. It's a sober reminder that sometimes the cheaper rent is actually a tax paid in nerves, and you never really know who or what is still looking for the person who lived there before you. When I was little, my parents bought the house that belonged to my dad's grandparents. I'm not sure how long the home was in my family, but I do know that my grandma lived there as a little girl. Now, when I was little, tiny in fact, I slept over my aunt's house for the night and my brother went to his uncle's house. The only people in the house were my mum and dad. My mum tells me that they were in their room at night next to a door that had a staircase that went to a bedroom upstairs. They said that they heard my voice calling Mum over and over again, upstairs and then on the staircase. They both recall the same thing, hearing my voice. I wasn't home though, so they went outside the house and looked for neighboring kids, but it was night and no one was outside. The family next to us was from a different country and did not call their mother traditional mum as well, and they knew that. Eventually I grew up a bit and I was going through puberty in this house, so I was already losing my mind as a kid, but I recall some very concerning moments in my young life there. I lived upstairs in that room and I was going through it as one does, but I was only about 9 and thought about putting something on my neck and floating, if you catch what I mean. And I tried, but luckily I was immature and didn't succeed. The upstairs had a staircase and it was open with white wooden balcony around it so you could look down. And that room, it still gives me the creeps. When I was younger, my aunt's boyfriend's brother died on train tracks a couple of miles from the house, and you could hear that train come through at night. At the night of, I slept in the living room and woke up at dawn standing on my tippy toes looking at a window that was next to the fireplace at the sky. At this time of the morning, the sun was coming up and there were stars out. I could hear the train, and when I woke up later, my mum had told us that he had died. I think about this a lot. On another occasion, I was in my upstairs room and we had it split down the middle. My sister's crib was by the stairs and I was on the other side of the room. We split it off by her closet and my little couch that I got from a garage sale. You couldn't see the closet doors from my bed, just the back of it. I was texting on my little flip phone and a towel flew and hit the wall. I was so scared that I couldn't move. I refused to be in that room anymore after that too. I decided to move into the basement of the house when I was in 6th grade. I had a folding cot, an old TV. It was going to be my space. I suffered from sleep paralysis pretty much every single night, and I felt watched, uneasy and sick down there. My mum told me that my grandpa built the basement out. I'm not too sure about the basement, but it was not a good place to be, I'll tell you that much. We all heard footsteps down there, multiple times, shutting doors, running in the basement. Unfortunately, that was the most scary, but before we moved out, I took a school photo of myself and hid it in the baseboards of the stairs of the scary upstairs room. I doubt it's still there, but I heard the new owners gutted it years ago and grey flipped it. But here's my dilemma. I've been having nightmares about this house ever since we moved out years and years ago. We moved out before I went to middle school. I'm in my 30s now. It's been a hot minute since I've been at that house, but my dreams are always supernatural, about me in the house as an adult. The most recent dream was about a demonic spirit telling me that I needed to paint a picture of a window with green ivy around it. The upstairs room's window next to my bed, the wall outside was covered in ivy. It completely took the house on that side too. And it also told me that I needed to paint myself at the window. I told my husband this and he said absolutely not, that it sounds like a trap and some conjuring stuff. I agree, but I really feel like I should paint it, and I'm not sure why I feel so inclined to do it. The house has been haunting me ever since, and we've all had supernatural experiences there, even my grandma as a little girl. So there's this one time that I was playing with my toys in the basement of my parents' house. I was around 6 years old, so it must have happened in 2011. For context, at this time, the house was not fenced, and it happened a few times that people just walked through my garden to access the field behind my house, so it could seem not unusual, but wait for it. After eating dinner, my parents would let me play with my toys for a little while, since it was the Halloween vacation at that point. I can't say for sure what time it was, but it was definitely after 7 p.m. because I remember that it was already very dark outside. While I was playing, I heard a noise coming from, I thought at the time, the boiler room that is behind me. It usually makes noises, so I continued playing without even thinking about it. The door of the boiler room was closed like always. It's always closed because otherwise we can smell the fuel in the whole house. Anyway, I continued serving plastic food to my non-existent clients in my non-existent restaurant. Then I heard another noise. That time I turned around to see what made that noise, and where it came from, but nothing. The door of the boiler room was closed like it was supposed to be. I was confused, but didn't worry more than that and continued playing. Until I heard a knock coming from the window facing me. I looked up and there was a man standing there looking at me. The guy had his head between the bars of the window, and still today I could recognize him, even if it did happen 15 years ago. He was wearing his 90s Nike jacket and a faded blue cap. He had a beard of 2 days, and he looked like he was very tired. I remember him having these massive dark circles under his eyes, his expression being neutral when I noticed him. After a few seconds of staring in shock, I ran upstairs to my parents, telling them about what I had just saw. My dad immediately ran down to the basement. He grabbed a hammer and got out ready to attack the guy if needed. But by then, the guy had just disappeared into the darkness. My dad even went to drive around the village that I live in to look for him, but we never did see him again. We believe that he probably ran through the field behind my house. These events, though, honestly traumatized me at that age. I was having a lot of nightmares, dreaming of this almost every night for a while. I had night terrors because of this, and still today I'm pretty terrified when I'm in this basement. It always just gives me the chills and makes me want to run upstairs as quickly as I can. So early this summer, I, male 16, got my driving license for a 50cc moped, common and popular thing here in Europe. And I was really hyped to finally get to ride with my friends and explore places that I couldn't have explored before without my moped. And everything went great for the first couple of days, until one day, me and my friends were just out cruising and having fun. It was a warm and sunny summer evening, so we decided to go ride on some smaller gravel roads on the countryside. We did that, and we were riding there for maybe, an hour, until everyone had to get home but me. It was probably like 1 or 2 in the morning at that point, but I still decided to stay there and just ride around and listen to some music in my headphones. I started riding towards this one small village, surrounded by fields, and there was a lot of farms there too. I rode a bit slower there than usual, so there wouldn't be any accidents with all the tractors and farm vehicles. But after I got through the village and closer to a bigger road, the sun was almost gone and it was getting really dark outside. It had been a nice ride, and I decided to start heading home on this almost empty highway, even though the speed limit was like 100 kilometers an hour, and it's not allowed to ride a 50cc moped on the highways. But I did it anyway, as there was really no one around. Home was almost 30 kilometers away from where I was at that point, so I was just going full speed in case to get home before my parents found out that I'd been outside until 3 in the morning. But when I'd been riding for like 15 minutes, I saw a car stopped on the side of the road with its lights on, and it had me a little bit creeped out, to be honest. I just pushed it out of my mind though and kept going, since I was almost halfway home anyway. But after a few minutes, I noticed the car from earlier speeding up after me, and since I have a moped that only goes like max 80 kilometers an hour, the car caught up to me pretty quickly. And then the car started to pass me, and when it got beside me, I looked in there and I saw a man, but he was covered in blood, and he was looking straight at me with the crazy eyes, if you get what I mean. He was smiling at me, so I got very scared, and he rode alongside me for probably a minute, but man, it felt a lot longer than that, with him just staring at me and looking at the road every once in a while. Then the man raised his other hand, waved me goodbye before putting his finger on his lips and doing the shush thing. After that, he sped off and got off of the highway onto a ramp to a smaller road, and when he did that, I saw that the car didn't even have a license plate. That was a super creepy experience, and I don't know why the man was covered in blood, and why he had been parked on the side of an empty road at 3 in the morning. But what I do know for sure is that he's definitely not somebody that I would hope to ever meet again. I would really like to try and find an explanation for these events that happened to me while I was younger. It still sticks in my head to this day and makes me feel anxious for some reason. So while I lived with my mother, she said that she had experienced quite strange things happening in our house, from the kettle turning on randomly, even whenever we got a new kettle, to her just feeling uncomfortable during the night. When I got to about 10, I believe, one night I got up to use the toilet, and I remember seeing a man standing in our hallway, which really scared me. I ended up screaming for my mum to help after running back to my bed. I remember telling her what I saw and her actually believing me, which I think helped me cope a bit. Another time, which this one still scares me the most, it was around the time I was 14. I was in the same house, and it must have been about 6 in the morning. I woke up to a strange feeling, like somebody was watching me from next to my bed. The way my back was facing, I couldn't see though. I slowly turned to see a shadow silhouette standing right next to me, faceless. I didn't make a noise or anything, but I punched where the silhouette was, and then when I released, I just sort of laid back down straight away in a fetal position, because a very strong feeling of fear and anxiety washed over me. I couldn't move, as I thought that it would do something to me. I stayed there like that for about 20 minutes and slowly turned to find it not there anymore. After I moved into my grandparents' house at about 15, I started to feel the same feelings I felt at my mum's about 2 months in. And one night, I heard what sounded like bare feet running to and from my bedroom door to the back outside door. It was a wooden floor and it was quick, like it was running, and then it would just sort of stop dead right outside of my door. Then it would wait for a few seconds and start running again. I texted my grandma asking if she or my grandfather were walking around. Luckily, she normally wakes up to text, so she replied no, and I then said, "Could you please come down the stairs with our dog and turn the lights on?" As soon as she walked out with the dog though, I could hear my dog barking and then my grandma walking up to the door. And these were completely different footsteps. Weird stuff would happen all the time too, and I always felt like something was watching me. I invited my girlfriend over one time when me and her were 16, and she stayed the night with me. At about 1, I could hear the footsteps again, so I woke her up and said, "Can you hear that?" Without saying anything, she listened, and then nodded at me yes. We did the same thing and texted my grandma, asking if she was moving about the house, and she said no again. But this time, I got the courage to swing open the door. I guess I was trying to act tough in front of the missus, but when I did this, there was nothing but a cold feeling of dread. There are 2 more times I had experienced something. One time I was having strange dreams of being tickled in my sleep. I woke up to still be feeling this feeling and started freaking out as I'm awake and feeling somebody tickling my body. I leaned over my bed, not sure why, but I looked at the floor in the pitch dark, when out of nowhere, this strange blast of air, which felt like when you sort of stick your head out the car window at a high speed and you can't hear, hits me in the face. Obviously, I didn't sleep for the rest of that night. The last incident happened, though, when I came back from living in Scotland. Interestingly, too, in Scotland, I had no issues at all. Anyway, I had pulled up to my grandparents' house with my ex-girlfriend, and we were just having a chat in my car. I look in the front window of my grandparents' house, and I see the same shadow silhouette that I saw all those years ago. Once I get into the house after coming in through the back door, I can hear the radio switch on up in the front room. My pop turns it off and says I haven't heard it turn itself on ever before. And really, that's about it. It's been helpful to share this to just get it off my chest, but if you have any answers, I would definitely love to hear them for closure. I have to try and stop thinking about these events that happened to me because they just make me feel a bit crazy and stupid. But anyway, if you have any information about what any of this could have been, then please do share it. My neighbor Tom rents his home and he doesn't seem to work. He just sort of sits on his porch smoking pot most days. We've always kept to ourselves, but when I moved in 3 years ago, he introduced me to his wife, Susie. She didn't say anything and quickly just went back inside. After that, I only ever saw different women coming and going, so I figured Susie was either made up or not really his wife since I never saw her again. But today, for the first time in 3 years, I saw Susie outside. She looked like she hadn't seen sunlight in years. Pale, mentally unwell, and staring at the ground. She might even be disabled, I'm not sure. As I pulled into my driveway, Tom quickly rushed her back inside though. Now, I'm really concerned that she's been kept inside all this time. Am I overreacting, or is this something that I should be worried about? Also, Tom has several vehicles, but only one is ever at the house at a time. A beat-up red Tahoe, a nice truck, a van, and a new silver Tahoe. It changes depending on the day or the week which one he's driving. But I've always found it odd, especially since it seems like he doesn't work, and I initially wondered why Susie never had a vehicle. Anyway, based on some feedback that I got, I decided to call for a wellness check for tomorrow on my way out of town. I've also since investigated a bit more and looked up the license plates on 2 of the 4 vehicles that he rotates out, and neither match the vehicles that they're on. I've spoken with a police officer who's a friend of a friend, and I shared all the details in the background. He's thinking that it will be best to have a cop pull Tom for the license plate the next time that he leaves the neighborhood, and while they're dealing with the mismatched plates, another officer will go to the house to perform a welfare check. I'm now waiting on an official callback to confirm all and take my statements on record, and I'll keep you guys posted about that for sure. But this whole situation, something just doesn't feel right. Me and my best friend at the time, we came from some pretty abusive home lives. As such, we often sought refuge in the woods near our neighborhood. We did this because, during the day, we would be free of our abusers and adults brushed this off as kids being kids. But on a particularly bad night, my drunk father invited his motorcycle gang over who were all terrible drunks themselves. They kept coming into my room trying to find me, but I hid away in my hamper, buried under my dirty clothes until they seemed to have given up or gotten too drunk to care. And quietly, after about an hour, I came out of the hamper and snuck out of my back window. We lived in a slab ranch-style house, and my back window went into our backyard, which was unlit and sealed with the exception of a small gate that was blocked by their bikes. I snuck over to the back fence, picked a corner, and climbed over it, tossing myself to the other side. The neighbor behind us watched me cut through his backyard, as he had many times, and let me be. We lived in a village, so everybody sort of knew about my dad, but would never do anything about it. Anyway, I ran to my best friend's house, a mere 2 blocks away, but when I arrived and tapped on her window, her own abusive parents were asleep. Since I couldn't come in and she didn't want me to be outside alone, she climbed out of her window, and the 2 of us walked to the woods. We settled next to a water reservoir meant to store rainwater in case of flooding, and we sat on the hill far from the road's view. She pulled out some snacks that she had brought with her, and we began conversing as 2 teenagers do about this and that. It was about 20 minutes later or so that we heard shuffling from inside of the reservoir. At first, we thought maybe a deer had jumped the chain-link fence, rare but possible, so we just sort of tried to ignore it. But then it got louder. It was also unusual movement, like a dragging almost, or a scraping sound against the brush. Though these woods were usually empty, especially near the reservoir where we were, save for typical animals, we became concerned that maybe there was another human around out to spook us, or worse. We slowly gathered up our snacks and we moved on from sitting to a sort of crouched position. Once we stood up, we could see, though, what looked like a woman laying against the side of the reservoir's wall, which had a steep incline made of brush and thin twiggy sort of trees. My friend and I became a little bit concerned at that. The state of her clothes, a light-colored dress, had tears and dirt everywhere. She herself looked absolutely soaked, despite it not having rained in months, which is typical for mid-November in my state. Are you okay?" my friend asked in her direction. "Do you need help?" I asked after a little bit of silence. Nothing. The woman didn't move, didn't say anything, and for a moment, we didn't know what to do. It honestly looked like she needed help, so we didn't want to just leave, but, who would we go to? Would she be here if we found help and came back anyway? My best friend and I began to whisper possible options to each other when the shuffling crawl resumed. We turned and looked at the woman's direction, but she wasn't crawling anymore. Instead, she was now sprinting towards us. She was going fast enough that the long disheveled hair that had been obscuring her face moved behind her, and her dark, swollen face was now visible. She had blue lips, white milky eyes, and began to screech all of a sudden. My best friend and I absolutely booked it. We ran as fast as we could to the streetlights and their orange glow, and we could hear her until we crossed the street, and then just silence. We turned back and looked at the fencing, huffing and puffing, looking for any signs of her. We saw nothing though, and began to talk about how it was probably a senior teen messing with us or something. But then we saw her again, standing inside the fence, just staring at us. The orange glow of the lights hit her, making her features seem soft, if not still unsettling. I took a step in her direction, believing now that she was probably just some sort of crazy homeless woman. She was behind the fence, and the time that it would take her to climb it made me confident. I spoke to her. I told her that she was a creep for scaring us like that, and that it wasn't our fault that she was homeless. I did the front-end motion with my shoulders, if you know, you know, and shouted for her to not be so reckless and mean. This must have made her angry too, as a part of me knew that it probably would have, but she started to rush the fence again. It was a tall fence, so I knew that we could duck through some yards to safety before she hit the ground on the other side. I watched her though, daring her, but she got to the fence and didn't climb it. Instead, she moved through the chain link fence as if it wasn't even there. At that, my best friend grabbed me and we started booking it back towards her house as fast as our legs would carry us. We heard one shout from the woman, a blood-curdling scream, but it sounded like it was fading in the distance, and soon she was gone. We never went back to the reservoir spot after that, and we only ever returned to the woods during the day. After that, the paths and the trails, they just no longer felt safe, and everything had a weird stillness or quiet about it. But we no longer heard birds or bugs, and it never felt safe there again. We were 16 at the time that this happened, and I've long since moved from that village. I went off to college, in fact, living in a suburb and then to a large city, and I'm actually packing up to move out of state entirely. The house that I'm leaving is near a lake, and packing up my life has meant keeping some odd hours. And for the first time in, years, I found myself up at night and moving boxes into the garage. I stopped and I took a look at the lake on my way back to the house, but I froze because I could have sworn that I saw that same woman crawling on her belly, dragging herself up the side of the lake through the mud that sat on the edge. In an instant, she was gone, and I don't know what I saw, but it was creepy enough that I rushed back into the house instantly. I'm not sure what this means, but my aunt is coming to sage the house and our things after this. She's also insisting on doing it for our new place before we move anything in. And, to be honest, I think I'm going to let her. I wanted to tell my best friend about all of this, but unfortunately she passed away a few years ago, and, well, that's another story entirely. This happened a few years ago. While I've never been a real skeptic, I guess, I never had an actual personal experience until this point. I could tell a dozen stories from that place, but hands down the scariest experience I've ever had is this. In 2021, I was working as a private investigator for a security firm, but would sometimes be called in to cover security guard posts. I was called in over a long holiday weekend, during which a factory was going to be shut down. I covered night shifts, and during shutdown, everything in the building was powered off. Lights, machines, everything save for things like security cameras, lights in the office, alarms, the boiler, and I think the Wi-Fi too. This was a huge factory. It took roughly an hour and a half to make one round, in fact. And the entire building was pitch black, so in order to do rounds we had mag lights, and the cell phone to scan barcodes near the doors to track our movements. We also had to write down the readings from several pressure valves on certain water risers. 2 of the risers were 10 feet apart, and behind 2 large pieces of machinery along a back wall. To get the readings, we couldn't hold both the mag light and the cell phone, so we had to use just the cell phone to navigate. My first round, it had gone fine. No issues, everything secure, all doors are locked, everything accounted for. I had just started my second round and was getting the measurements from the risers. I got the first reading, turned to my left and was getting ready to walk the 10 feet to get the second, when a shadow appeared in front of me. It didn't really have a distinct shape, but was human height, and so black that I could distinguish it from the already pitch black of the factory. Before I could do anything, it flew directly at me, passing through my chest, and it was the most horrid, soul-deep, ice-cold feeling that I've ever had. I instantly collapsed on the floor, and while I don't know how much time had passed, I managed to call my boss at some point. Thankfully, he came and found me, called EMS, and while he obviously thought that I was nuts, this building had a reputation for paranormal activity and negative energy. It had ended the career of more than one guard, allegedly, so he knew something had happened. When EMS came, my vitals were all over the place. My heart rate was 180, while my blood pressure was only 74/40. I was in the hospital for a couple of days. But while I doubt he ever really fully believed me, my boss has seen me handle first responses after a tornado, an active shooter, and even a hostage situation with relative sanity intact. And even he admitted that whatever happened rattled me to my core. I don't know what it was, a demon, a reaper, or just some very angry spirit, but it was not friendly. To this day, just thinking about that experience gives me chills too, makes me sick to my stomach and really puts me on edge. At 32 years old, I still refuse to be in a pitch black room again because of what I experienced that night. First of all, let me start by saying that I'm just some regular guy who thinks that, yeah, spirits are real and I believe in God, but I never think about any of this stuff or am spooked by it either. If I hear a strange noise while sleeping, I ignore it and just carry on. I honestly pay it no mind and go about my days just normally, but something I witnessed about a year ago, it still bothers me until this day, and I randomly think about it from time to time. It was a regular day, and I was driving home at night like I always do. I'm going down a residential street that's about a few blocks from my home. I've driven down that street like maybe 1,000 times or more. Think of a 2-lane street each way, wide street with gated communities on both sides. I want to say it was around 9:30 at night. I was driving home from my son's baseball practice. My son was sleeping in the back seat. I make a right turn into that street, and traffic was a lot lighter than usual. If I recall correctly, it was one car quite far away coming my direction, and perhaps 1 or 2 cars in a distance behind me. So as I'm driving down the street, I notice what appears to be a person walking on the sidewalk on my right-hand side. He's walking towards the same direction that I'm driving, so I can only see his backside. And I say his because it had the body frame of a male, as it was tall, lanky, and medium hair that reached its shoulders. He was also wearing something like a black hat, skinny figure, black pants, black shirt. If I had to guess, maybe around 6'4", 6'5". I keep driving, and as I get closer to this person, perhaps around 20 to 25 feet away, I was suddenly completely stunned. This person turned around as it saw my lights approach, but in a very quick and vulgar way, like when somebody calls you over and over, and you turn around and say, "What?" Well, in that kind of way. And let me tell you that whatever it was not human. And no, it was not a mask. If it was a mask, it was more real than what CGI can do in movies nowadays. It was this monster-looking face, alone on a sidewalk in an empty street. It turned around, saw me, and stared at my car as I drove past it. I looked in my rearview mirror, and it had stopped walking and just sort of stared. Immediately, my first reaction and thought to myself, aside from shock, was, "Dear Lord, what did I just witness?" And until this day, I still have no answer for it. So this happened about 5 years back. I was dating a girl who was prone to violent outbursts without warning. Her choice in decor was all dark and twisted paintings, a Satanistic Bible as her coffee table book of choice. At times, she was a very sweet and loving person, but would switch on a dime to her outbursts. She even once pulled a knife on me, cutting my hand when I tried to take it from her. One night, though, I was staying over. We were laying in bed watching movies and relaxing. I went downstairs to the kitchen to grab a drink from the fridge. The kitchen was dark, just lit up from the light above the stove. I opened the fridge door, reached down to grab my soda. When I stood back up and closed the door, starting to walk back, I was met with a shadow, not on a wall, but rather right in front of me. It was taller than I was. I kind of jumped back in fright, only to have it disappear in front of me. Walking back to the room, I was a bit confused and rattled, I guess. At first, I tried to play it off as my shadow, but the placement was just all wrong, let alone it not being on a wall. I get back into bed clearly shaken, not wanting to say anything. I didn't bring it up. But then she asked me what was wrong, and I said, "Nothing, I just got a bit of a fright." She replied with, "You saw it, didn't you?" I asked her what she meant by that, and in a very calm voice she just said, "The shadow guy." She claimed to have been seeing it most of her life, and it wasn't something to worry about, allegedly. Our relationship lasted 8 months in total, and a number of unexplained things happened in that house. However, that was the only time that I saw something directly. There were other instances of things happening, mostly when we would be fighting and screaming. From the sounds of footsteps coming from upstairs to one time hearing a loud crash from the upstairs bathroom. We went to investigate and found that all the soaps and the shampoo bottles in the shower, that they had found their way onto the floor despite being on tiled shelves. She never seemed worried or upset when these things would happen, which is a bit strange, I know, but still to this day I really question what I saw that night. My children have been talking about seeing something in their room the last few weeks. This thing, they both described it as tall, lanky, grey-skinned with big black beady eyes. They described it as being surprised looking, but it's almost taking on features of people in the house. So, it is hairless, sometimes, but other times has long dark hair like myself. They said it's almost looking like one of the kids in facial structure or their aunt who they look a lot alike. The first time my oldest saw it, she actually saw an arm come out of her closet and wiggle its long fingers, and after it was peeking around the closet at her, when she would look at it, it would duck back in. She's 16, so she was like, "Oh man, I must be tired." But my youngest, she hasn't been told anything so as not to scare her, saw the same thing looking over their door at her. My mum was over and we got into the subjects of ghosts one time, enthusiasts that we are. My oldest daughter brought up seeing something, and before she could even get it out, my younger child was like, "Did it look like this?" and proceeded to describe it in detail, and my oldest said yes. So I know that they are definitely seeing the same thing, but I honestly haven't the faintest idea of what it could be. I can't tell if it's something bad because, it hasn't really done much besides show itself, but they do hear whispers a lot in there, allegedly. So far, they say that it hasn't been seen outside of their room. It's only ever been seen in there, but I am determined to get it out. I have to know what I'm dealing with first, obviously, but once I do, I'm going to try and get rid of it. So this may all seem insane or delusional, but I would really love to get someone's feedback on this, a second opinion at least. This entire thing is true, I can assure you that. I've never stopped thinking about it or wondering about this night too. So, in 2021, I moved into the house that I currently live in. I'm renting it. The house was built in the 1950s, from what I can gather through records. All seemed fine when we first moved in, except for the red room. Upstairs, there is a triangular attic-type space, painted completely red. It gave me terrible feelings of dread when I first walked into it. For months and months, I left it empty too. I wouldn't venture into it. My mother, who is a Christian but does not believe in ghosts, came to visit the house when we moved in. She walked into that room and said, "Oh my goodness, you should consider having our pastor come see this and pray," because she also got the dreadful feelings. Our bedroom is downstairs below that room, and at night, I would always hear like walking or creeping up there and lay awake sort of scared. But then it all went downhill. You see, as I got into bed one night, I heard an echo or young sort of female type voice whisper my name directly in my left ear. I froze and went completely cold. Waking up my partner in a panic, he shrugged it off. The next night, I heard the same voice, but coming from the next room, saying hi. I tried my best to ignore these things until one of the scariest nights that I've ever had. I was upstairs. My office is directly beside the red room, a door separating them. I was at my vanity taking off my makeup when the red room door slowly opened. Over the months, it would randomly open quite often, scaring me a bit, but my partner just blamed a draft, even though there wasn't one. But I tried to ignore that door. But that was when I heard loud footsteps downstairs walking around through the house. Assuming it was my partner at first, I finished my skincare and came down for bed. The whole house was dark, so I thought, that's weird. I just heard him walking around. I walked into the bathroom to pee, and as I passed the kitchen, I saw a tall, dark shadow-type figure walk past me. I could see it through the light coming through the windows. I assumed it was my partner. I even spoke out loud saying, "Hey, I'll be in bed in a minute." After the bathroom, I walked to our room. Silent, because he was completely asleep. In a panic, I shook him awake saying, "How long have you been asleep for? Weren't you walking around earlier and in the kitchen?" Through his sleepy demeanor, he said, "I've been asleep for what?" And he looked at his watch. 2 hours? And rolled back over. I went completely silent and cold again. I turned around to face where the kitchen was, and I saw nobody. But I was completely terrified by now. I quickly climbed into the covers and tried to wake him to tell him that we needed to check the house because somebody was in here. He didn't listen though and said to just go back to sleep. I turned my face and I saw a tall figure standing directly over him beside the bed on his side. At that, I couldn't hold it in anymore, and I let out a massive scream and grabbed him. This made him wake up, confused and asking, "What's wrong? What's wrong?" I cried and said that I just saw a person again over him. And when I said that, he jumped up and checked our whole room, under the bed too. He said that there really isn't nobody here. He's a skeptic, always has been, never was afraid of the house. And well, that all changed once he got back into bed. We laid there, and as I finally started feeling less afraid and drifting to sleep, a loud bang like a stomp on the ground or dropping a brick was heard. The sound came from the floor on his side of the bed, right where I had seen the figure. He immediately was shaken from his sleep and screamed, "Okay, what the heck was that?" I could tell that he was afraid. I'd never actually seen him afraid. I started to panic, saying that I told you there was something there. Crying a little bit now, I really didn't know what to do. He immediately went around checking the entire house, making sure nobody had actually broken in. He got back into bed and I said, "You know that it wasn't a person, right?" He didn't know how to respond. This is all 100% true. It happened early last year in 2023. After this event, we moved our bedroom to another room across the house and turned the old one into a bonus room. Since moving our room, nothing has happened since, which is a bit bizarre. I wondered if the entity or whatever it was feeding off of me easily because I was sleeping directly below that red room. I'm not sure, but since then the only occurrence has been the red room door opening, the doorknob rattling a bit too. I now rebuke whatever it is when this occurs. I'm not the most religious, but I very loudly and firmly let it know that it's not welcome and it needs to leave me alone. So, I'm here to get your thoughts about what all of this could be and what you think that I should do about it. I generally consider myself a paranormal skeptic. I'm not religious and I have a hard time believing in ghosts. However, I like to entertain the idea. I enjoy ghost stories and movies, and I wouldn't rule out the paranormal altogether as an explanation for a situation that otherwise lacks an explanation. And this story falls into the latter category. This took place almost 20 years ago when I was around 15. I'm from a small town in the Midwest filled with plenty of older houses. One weekend, my parents took me with them to an open house at a house across town. It was a massive 2-story farmhouse built in 1840. It was at the very back of its property, maybe 5 acres, and surrounded by mature trees and plants. The land had been somewhat decently maintained, but the house hadn't had anyone living in it for a while. It wasn't dilapidated inside or out, and it could certainly be lived in immediately, but it needed some TLC. Think the house from Ghosts in the UK, but with more Berber carpet. The approach to the house was beautiful though, and had such a neat charm to it. We all really liked it. However, once we were in the house, I just felt, strange. This was an open house, so there were probably 4 or 5 other groups of people touring throughout, and despite that, it was just so strangely quiet. We toured all around, starting with the upstairs. There was such an odd vibe up there too. I kept feeling kind of dizzy and claustrophobic, even though it was a huge house. I was ready to leave after the weirdness upstairs, and from seeing the amount of maintenance that we'd have to do as well. But I was along for the ride, so we went down to the main level and looked all around. It felt a lot better down there, and I didn't get as uncomfortable as I did upstairs. Finally though, the real estate agent started funneling everyone down to the basement. The door was in the kitchen, and it led to the kind of basement that you'd probably imagine a house built in 1840 would have. Bare bulb hanging by a thread above the stairs, completely unfinished walls, dirt floor, and stairs that would be perfect to have your ankles grabbed from the other side. You know the ones. Well, we all went down to the basement as a group and looked around a bit. Really not much to see except for cobwebs and old wiring. I admit that it could have been the old horror movie basement influencing my opinion, but I felt super weird down there as well, and was ready to leave. Once everyone had their fill of looking around, we headed back up the stairs to the kitchen. I ended up being the very last person in the group, which meant that I was the last person up the stairs. Since the rest of the group was sort of loitering around in the kitchen, we had to slow down on the stairs so everyone could pass by. And I remember, clear as day, I was standing on the 3rd step from the top, waiting to step into the kitchen and finally get out of this dang basement, when all of a sudden, my hair gets pulled from behind. I had or have short hair, and it felt like someone grabbed the hair right in the middle of my head and gave it a tug. My first thought was, maybe I got my hair caught in something on the wall, so I looked all around for the offending object. But the only thing that I could have gotten my hair stuck in was a wall-mounted fire extinguisher, but I know that I was nowhere near it. At that, I made a beeline out of there, soon followed by my parents. When we got in the car, I told them what happened. We've talked about this story every now and then throughout the years, mostly in a wasn't that strange sort of way. It remained my favorite ghost story to tell, mostly since I don't have any other first-hand ones. The property, though, it was later sold to a local restaurateur, who sadly bulldozed a lot of trees and front lawn to build a new Italian restaurant. The house remained intact at the back of the property, and still does to this day. But fast forward around 4 years, I had moved to college and largely forgot about the hair-pulling thing. My mum called me and said that she had just had her mind blown and that she needed to share this. She had gone to a hair appointment with her stylist, and the topic of the Italian restaurant and house came up. She told my mum that there's allegedly an older female spirit that likes to mess with people, especially men, on the steps leading to the basement. She said this too without my mum having ever mentioned my experience to her. She had no idea that I had my hair pulled 4 years earlier. Of course, my mum proceeded to share my story from the open house with her, and I swear chills went down my spine. In fact, I'm getting chills even just sharing this. The house is still standing, and the Italian restaurant is still open as well. Part of me wants to go back to that house, but a much more sensible part of me wants, nothing to do with it. Anyway, if you've gotten this far, then thanks for listening. Growing up in rural Alaska, I experienced a lot of weird things, like amazing herds of caribou, strange weather, but the weirdest things to me are the times that I wasn't able to see the source of yelling or hollering. A lot of times I traveled alone throughout the Brooks Range and up into the North Slope to hunt and trap. From a young age, I learned how to hunt and field dress animals too, set up survival shelters, and even how to travel at night with the usage of the constellations like my ancestors before me. But these long and very arduous journeys sometimes brought me more than I was willing to endure. In the winter of 2017, I had a trap line along the left side of the valley headed northbound. The trap was set every few miles, and I was traveling along my trail when I saw a figure in a bunch of diamond willows ahead of me. The bunch of brush was about a mile or so away, but I could see the dark figure walking like a person. I wondered who would be out in January when it's the coldest time of the year just walking like this, when they just suddenly vanished. I looked out of my binoculars and scanned the area and just put it off as my imagination or someone with a snow machine, a snowmobile for you lower 48ers, and they had taken off along my trail or something. So I continued on. At my next trap, I stopped and shut off my machine. It was calm and surprisingly warm, for that time of year anyway, so I was able to shed my parka to reset the spring trap that I had come across. As I set the trap, I then started to hear a low, bellowing noise from up in the small valley. It came off like a person just yelling at first, but then it grew deeper, like a bear warning off another, but it was January. Nothing like that would be out and about. The most that you'd find would be wolves, maybe wolverines and caribou. Even moose tend to travel south for that time of the year. As I started to pack up, the noise began again though. It grew louder and louder, and I remembered that figure that I saw and wondered if they had anything to do with it. But I did my best to ignore the noise like my elders had taught me, and to just go about my business. But then, suddenly, I could feel eyes on me. I looked towards the valley where I felt the weird sensation, and there was nothing. I even pulled out my binoculars and looked, but nothing. I listened for the noise again, and when the bellowing began again, I responded this time. I did the same noise back at it, and it stopped quickly, like it recognized the noise that I made. Then it got eerily silent. I was uneasy, so I packed up and I left as quickly as possible. And I haven't been back there since. I pulled the trap line that winter, and I do not plan on going back. When I was 4 years old, I had cancer. When I was 5, the Make-A-Wish Foundation built me a cubby house next to our shed. I would go down there nearly every day and play. And one day, however, I noticed what looked like a man standing in the trees behind the shed. Naturally, I stayed away from it. When I had friends over, my friend, who was 2 at the time, would scream and cry about not going near the trees, and everyone made fun of her. Whatever it was, it would never appear when adults were around though, sometimes vanishing when we tried to point it out to our older siblings and parents. One day though, I decided to check out the area on my own without supervision, and I came across the man, except he had 4 arms, a green coat, and a jester's cap on. He had red eyes and pasty skin with red polka dots. He looked at me and sighed a big sigh as if he had found me after looking for me for so long. I noticed he started inching closer, and that was when I decided to run away. I eventually told my grandparents, who thought that I had watched the movie Clowns. My friend then says that she saw a jester under the trees, wearing red and white and having a pin on its chest. Apparently it used to reach out to her and watch her through her window at night. But does this sound familiar to anyone? Has anyone come across something like this? I came across something online called a Caraveldi, whose profile picture and description match nearly identically to this. If you know anything, then please do share your thoughts. So I live in a 40s concrete duplex, and ever since moving in a year ago, things always feel a little tense once the sun goes down. And every now and then things are moved around whenever you leave a room and come back, and occasionally whenever I'm up late working on my computer, I'll see white figures out of the corner of my eye, always in the same spot in the room. I also once had a sleep paralysis encounter where I saw it clearly as it zoomed across the room at me, but I think that I really messed up just now. So my bedroom door faces into a small hallway, and I've always made sure that when coming into my room, I always face my bed and never look away until the door is closed behind me. I don't know why I started doing this or even remember where it started, but it's just like an instinct, I guess. A few minutes ago, though, around 11:40 p.m., I got hungry, so I went to the kitchen to grab something to eat, but when I came back to my room, I don't know why I did it, but as I closed the door, I took a glance behind me into the hallway and saw something that I can only compare to like a mix of SCP-1471 and No Face from Spirited Away, like this white mask-like face, a little taller than me, and I don't think that I saw a body. I'm sharing this on my computer, and I just feel like a kid getting called to the principal's office, and I keep looking away to the spot in my room that the white thing likes to be at, because it keeps feeling like someone is standing next to me, and I keep seeing like a swishing white blur, like someone waving a sheet out of the corner of my eye. Also, just recently I froze in place because I could have sworn that it felt like someone put their hand on my shoulder for a couple of seconds. I don't know what to do about any of this, so I hope that somebody will hear this and will be able to help me. So I'm hoping to get some feedback on something unusual that I experienced a few years ago. I've always been a bit skeptical of paranormal phenomena, but this encounter has always stayed with me. I want to share what happened and see if anybody else has had a similar experience or can offer at least any insights. So, this happened when I was 16. It was around 7 to 8 p.m. and I was in my fully lit bedroom scrolling through Instagram. I was awake and fully aware of my surroundings when suddenly my alarm clock turned on by itself and started playing Cake by the Ocean. A random detail, I know, but I remember feeling a bit uneasy at that moment, like something was off in the room, like I wasn't alone. I looked up and there, right next to my alarm clock, was what I can only describe as a humanoid entity. It wasn't solid, but rather it seemed to be sort of made of light. The light was bending in a way that formed the shape of a person. Arms, legs, head, torso, but no fine features. It was almost like a distortion of light, kind of like a heat mirage is the best way to describe it. The room also seemed a little bit more brighter than normal, almost like the entity was somehow affecting the electricity or the environment or something. I remember feeling terrified, but also knowing that whatever it was there clear as day. My eyes started watering and I couldn't speak. I ended up slowly backing out of the room, closing the door and running upstairs to get my dad, and when we went back down, it was gone. I've never experienced anything like this. I know some might chalk it up to just a vivid imagination or something psychological, but it felt real. My mum also mentioned that I had an imaginary friend when I was little, and she had a psychic once even mention it. That has always stuck with me a bit, and now I'm wondering if there's any sort of connection to what I saw all those years later. I'm curious to see if anybody else here has had any similar encounters with a light-based or energy entity like this, or if you have any insights into what I might have experienced. Thanks for listening, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts. So I'm Native American and collect sage on our res in a beautiful river gorge. I took the same buddy from the last story from the Passade shower, and We ended up high on a primitive road, miles from the highway, overlooking said gorge. It was already dark, but there was a warm wind coming off the river. He had never been on native land before, and I told him that we thank the earth and ask permission before taking her bounties. Cheesy, maybe, but I'm not taking chances and am always respectful. He's so white, though, that he's practically translucent. I call him Alabaster as a bit of a joke, but he's always been respectful about native customs and all that, so we get along. We kept hearing what sounded like tiny rabbits in the scrubby sagebrush all around us. There was some scrubby brush and trees that were dense and maybe 15 feet high. We were on res land, not where houses were though, and I thought maybe someone let their horses or livestock graze, as there was a large metal trough right there that we were hearing the small animal chatter from. This chitter was high-pitched and sounded really adorable, to be honest. It was at night and in the pitch dark, but the sound really didn't bother us. Anyway, my buddy wandered near the trough that was set off of the primitive road and in the scrubby trees, not really accessible to livestock or horses or anything. It was surrounded by sage and brush, but looked brand new and sort of shiny, I guess, which was a bit weird. But when my buddy got closer, something very large, larger than his 6'2" frame, came loudly crashing through that brush. We heard branches and brush snapping like a large wild animal was charging through there. We couldn't see anything, to be honest, nor did I want to, but I did my signature round 'em up whistle. And yes, I'm aware that whistling at night isn't really that good, but we scurried to the car quickly, apologized to whatever it was that we had disturbed, and quickly left the area. So I volunteered with a search and rescue group, and we were frequently dispatched to remote areas looking for missing people, recoveries, and occasionally even a crime scene search. We were called out one day after a logging company had unearthed a backpack belonging to a man who had been missing for over 20 years. The initial search for the man had been massive as well. Hundreds of people, dogs, a massive community effort, and nothing was ever really found. Not a single clue, in fact. It took us over an hour to crawl our team on unmaintained logging roads. The area had wild horses, which I had never even heard of in our area. What I mean is that it was really remote. From the jump as well, we had some really weird technical issues. My teammate's brand new Dodge truck stalled out on the logging road. I carry a litany of tools, jumper cables, tow ropes, etc., and the Dodge was just dead. I don't remember if we towed it to the side or what we did, but there was just really no fixing the issue. I mean, the truck just wouldn't even turn on. No lights, no electrical, but the battery was fine, which was really weird. Anyway, my rig's fog lights suddenly went out as well, and they never came back on. I chalked it up to extremely rough terrain knocking them loose, but a handful of us who were first on the scene descended through the Devil's Club hillside and immediately found one shoe, then another, a few pieces of clothing as we get further down the creek at the bottom. We found a mandible and then the top part of the skull within the first 10 to 15 minutes. The clothing, it matched the description of the missing man on the flyers that we had been given. One of my teammates sat down for a break and picked up a rib that was next to him. Been up and down the hill that he sat on and hadn't even noticed the human ribs that were scattered up the hillside. And that was really odd. We were all trained to grid search and had done so. Had we merely overlooked 5+ ribs that were laying plainly on the ground? Well, maybe. It was Devil's Club and brutal landscape after all. Plus, the clothing and the bones were out in the open, so anything could have happened to them over those years. Our old maps from the original search, though, showed that this area was searched. And I mean, it does happen. Maybe the guy was on the move and these weren't here during the initial search. I drove out of the scene to grab a sheriff who was going to guard the scene overnight. We had flagged every fork that we took with flagging tape as the logging roads were not marked. They were missing the number sign as well that usually sat at every fork, and they were definitely not well maintained. We were at least an hour off of any paved road at this stage, and I had noticed the direction that we took at every fork on the way in, right, left, etc. I was thankful that I had as well, because it was then that I noticed that our flagging markers were gone. I usually stayed out at sites overnight as I didn't have children at the time. I chose not to stay at this site though because, well, I guess it just felt a bit off to me. On another search for a lost hunter, we stumbled across hanging figures in the trees, made of twigs, moss, and lashed together with all sorts of tall grass or vines, straight up Blair Witch style. This would have been a few years after Blair Witch Project came out, so I don't know, maybe somebody was LARPing or something. The team was used to seeing weird stuff in the woods, but these were definitely unsettling. We camped overnight at that spot as we hadn't found the person. We slept in a circle with a small campfire in the middle. It was fall headed into winter, and so it was cold that night. We just had sleep sacks and bivy sacks, no tents or tarps or anything. And when we woke up, there was a small bundle of twigs lashed together with vines by our fire. We initially blamed our team clown who was always pulling pranks, but the look on his face told us that it wasn't him. We have no clue what or who it was, and we never did find out if it was a prank or not, but something tells me that it wasn't. Many of the old-timers swore that they had seen or heard or smelled Bigfoot out there as well. These were pretty tough men. Many had military or law enforcement experience even, and they weren't the kind of guys to get scared by much, but when they spoke about it, you could definitely tell that it got to them, at least a little bit. This has been going on for maybe 3 to 5 years at this point. I didn't think too much of it since it was always in the corner of my eyes whenever I was reading or watching TV or just trying to sleep or whatever. But within the 2 years and the 5, I noticed that I had seen a person, I guess you could say, a lot more. Whenever I'm alone now, though, I can feel something behind me or standing by me. I'm feeling it more in public even, but I thought that it was just myself being jumpy or something like that. Last year before November, I was waking up to shapes on my walls. They look like Viking runes as they glow within the morning light. I hardly see them anymore as much, but when I do, they always appear like glowing in the dark stars on my walls. Anyway, on Saturday, March 2nd, I saw this person that I always see in the peripheral of my vision more clearly for the first time. At first, I thought that it was my brother checking on me, but he doesn't own a red mask or a grey hoodie with words on them. I immediately went into the bathroom to talk to him, since our bathroom has 2 doors to our bedrooms on each side, to see that it was empty. I told my mum about it as she thinks that I was asleep when that happened, but I can assure you that I wasn't asleep or tired or anything. And then today at 10 a.m. I saw it again, peeking through my front door to the hallway of my upstairs. The person was now in all red as they closed the door without making a noise like before. I saw their eyes, all wide as their pupils were black. I felt myself panicking, but I acted like I didn't notice it, even though I was looking directly at it. The body, though, was all red, as it wasn't clothes anymore like before. I don't know what the heck I'm seeing, but whatever it is, it's getting closer with better vision of that thing, and that is definitely freaking me out. So, that's why I'm here. If you guys have any idea as to what this is or what I should do about it, then please do let me know. So, I know that this is going to sound impossible, but I found pictures on my phone of myself at 12:52 a.m. and I can assure you that I did not take them. I was in the kitchen just trying to heat up some food when I woke up not too long ago in the morning and I checked my phone. I was looking for something in the gallery and I found 2 pictures of myself from last night in the kitchen, and the angle that the pictures were taking was by the kitchen bar. Now, there was nothing behind the phone to support it from that angle, like at all. I remember I placed the phone by the kitchen bar, but even if that was the case, it's still not possible that those pictures were taken because someone had to tap the phone to take the pictures. Also, my phone is new and it's never lagged at all or anything. There was no one home, I was the only one there. I only had my cat and she was in my room. And the whole thing is just really creepy. Obviously, I checked my apartment and did everything possible to find the truth behind this. I mean, possibly it could have been an intruder or something. But that's just not the case at all, and really I have no logical explanation, nothing to solve this. I came to the conclusion that this must 100% be paranormal activity of some sort. I came to the conclusion that this must be 100% a paranormal activity of some sort, especially after trying to recreate the angle like the pictures. My phone had to be definitely up in the air like that and tilted to the right a little bit. Something paranormal is definitely messing with me, and if anyone knows what kind of entity that might be able to do something like this, then please do let me know. So I'm mostly telling this story because it was just so mind-boggling that I cannot resist the urge to tell somebody about it, anyone who will listen. So this happened in either 2008 or 2009, but in order to understand the story, you need a little bit of background, so bear with me. My sister Sharon has severe nonverbal autism. She's 4 years older than me, and at that time, I would have been maybe 19 or 20, and I didn't have a stable living situation. But at the time of the story, I was living with my friend and his girlfriend, Darlene, in their 1-bedroom apartment. I slept on one of the couches in the living room for a couple of $100 a month, and there were 2 couches that formed a right angle in front of the TV. Now, my sister had a day program that she would go to on the weekdays while my mum worked. The only problem was the program opened at the time that my mum needed to be at work, so she would drop my sister off wherever I was living, and I would watch her until a bus from the program would come to pick her up. This happened every single weekday. One morning, though, I woke up kind of delirious and looked over to the other couch, and there was my sister just sort of sitting there staring at me. She didn't look unusual or creepy. She was just sitting where she normally would and just sort of watching me. It's not uncommon for me to wake up in a sort of half-waking, half-sleep state where I kind of hallucinate, so when I saw her, I didn't really react and I just went right back to sleep. When I woke up later, I went about my day as normal. Some friends came to hang out. Darlene was in college and had an early morning class. She came home later that day and asked me why my sister was there that morning because it was a Saturday, a day Sharon wouldn't be there. This obviously confused me, and Darlene said when she was leaving to go to school, she saw my sister on the couch watching me sleep. Now, there was no way for her to know about what I saw because it wasn't of any importance to me at that time, so I just didn't tell anyone about it. The first thing that I thought was that, well, maybe my mum got confused about what day it was, and maybe she dropped her off at my house, but later realized what she did and came back to get her before I woke up. So I called my mum, but she told me that her and Sharon had been there all morning. It was incredibly bizarre to say the least, and to this day I'm still not sure how the heck to explain it. It never happened again, mind you, and I still don't know what happened, but the whole thing is just really, really eerie. So I live in an old farmhouse that was built in 1860, and I moved in many, many years ago. I was only about 12 years old when we moved in, but when my mother told me that I was sleeping upstairs, I immediately got an unsettling feeling without even knowing anything about the house. So I got all of my stuff up there and I slept up here. After about 2 years, I started feeling very uncomfortable in my own room and feeling like I wasn't welcome at exactly 11 o'clock every night. I've even had friends come over that I haven't said anything about this to them, and around 11 o'clock, without failure, every single one of them has said that they want to leave my room. This started about 2 years ago, and I originally had just put it out of my mind and tried to ignore it. But after about 6 months of it, I went to sleep and woke up to an old woman standing over my head. I blinked, I waved my hands in front of me, and she was just standing over my face, staring. I watched her, terrified, fade out of existence over a few minutes with a terrible smile. I didn't go into my room for weeks after that, and then about 3 weeks later, the weird energy was just gone. So I was fine sleeping up there for about a year and a half, and then the weird feeling at 11 o'clock started every night, all over again. I started burning sage as soon as I would feel weird, and this has always helped. And then going downstairs to sleep on the couch. Flashback though to about a week ago, and I got that weird feeling. I started burning sage, and immediately my sage just would not burn no matter how hard I tried. Then it went up in a huge flame and blew out in the opposite direction of my breath, and I watched the flame go up to the side, so I went downstairs, and the entire night I just saw something peeking around the corner by my stairwell. And the fact that I was still seeing things downstairs really worries me, because I've always gone down there to get away from the bad energy. Well, this has been going on since then, and anytime I look out of my peripheral vision, I see an all-black figure of a person just staring at me. I guess I'm just trying to get some advice on, what to do, because I feel like things are escalating, and I just don't know how to go about fixing it before everything goes too far. And for anybody that's wondering why I don't sleep upstairs, it's because whenever I get that feeling, I'm terrified that I'm going to wake up to that old woman standing over my face again. So I choose to just sleep on the couch to make sure that I don't have to go through that again. That experience was truly traumatizing, and I would do anything to stay away from whatever that was. So back in 2004 or 2005 or something like that, my girlfriend and I were driving around, and I decided to go to the Honda dealership in town to look at motorcycles. This was completely random and totally spur of the moment. Also, social media didn't exist at this stage, and there was just no way nobody knew that we were going to be going there. Anyway, we walk in, and there's this short, older-looking black dude who looks like he's in kind of an argument with the salesman. The salesman is literally trying to get this dude to leave. And like a second or two after we walk in, the old black dude, not an Always Sunny reference, but anyway, he turns around, stares right at my girlfriend and I, proceeds to totally ignore the salesman as though he isn't even there. He walks right up to her and I, introduces himself as Ramses, knows my name, knows my girlfriend's name, and remember, there's no social media back then, knows about us, and starts to tell me about my grandpa and his war history. He shakes my hand again and leaves. Apparently, all he wanted to do was meet me. Also, he looked older, but he had the eyes of a way younger dude. Honest as well, I promise you that I'm not making this up, and I'm just as confused as you are about it. And apparently that dude had been waiting there for me to show up. He allegedly knew that I was going to be there. He knew who I was, he knew my girlfriend, he knew my grandpa, he even knew his war history. My girlfriend and I both had our minds blown. phone. We go home, I tell my mum, and she tells my sister. My sister calls me on my flip phone, and she's all spooked too. A lot of weird stuff in my family going back since I was born, so when stuff like this happens, it can sort of mess with us, but nobody in my family will deny any of it. Even if my grandpa somehow knew this guy, which I highly doubt, there's no way that he would have known my girlfriend. I mean, my grandpa never even met her, not once, had no idea that she even existed, didn't talk to that side of the family, not even one iota for who knows, until I started talking to my dad again in 2022 or so. Now, here's what I think. Here's the mainly feasible options. And yes, that's where I'm at in my life, since I know that this is all real, and so I have to start finding explanations for all of it. And when stuff gets really weird, you have to start thinking outside of the box a little bit, right? Anyway, one possibility is that it was an angel. And this lines up with another, maybe even crazier story with another old black dude named Eli. I'll have to share that story another time because it changed my life, but the second is that it was some sort of time travel thing or something. And the third is something outside of all of this. This one could also lead us back to the angel, but like I said, this is obviously all sort of crazy and I'm just theorizing here. But what do you think? That dude was there waiting for me and he knew me. In fact, he knew things that he shouldn't have known. I am a long-distance hiker. I've hiked the entire JMT twice in both directions. I've hiked many miles of the Pacific Crest Trail, as well as numerous random trips in my time in the outdoors. I have probably maybe a year of collective time sleeping outside in the wilderness, and have hiked over 2,000 miles collectively at a minimum. I have only managed to encounter 2 bears, some coyotes. I have smelled a mountain lion once, and even heard one chirping near me. I'm not a big believer in cryptids or anything and such, but I do have a story that honestly makes me question that a bit. You see, in 2022, I hiked the John Muir Trail in the Sierra Nevada in California. It is a long-distance hiking trail that spans 211 miles from Yosemite Valley to Mount Whitney and takes about a month to complete. The trail is remote and located in some of the most amazing untouched nature that the country has to offer. I hiked the previous trails in a tradition southbound direction, and in 2022, I hiked the trail northbound towards Yosemite with my wife and female friend of ours. This story is on that 2022 trip. So one day, about halfway through our trip, when the afternoon was getting ready to end, we decided to camp in a place called Grouse Meadows. The previous year I enjoyed fishing here, and the gentle river that curves back and forth through the meadow, it makes for a really nice place to swim and filter water from. We started to make camp for the night, and I noticed a large buck about 10 yards from us staring at us. It then started approaching, and I started to yell at it just to, shoo it away. It circled around us a bit and left from us down the way that we had come from. I decided that I was going to catch a few fish before the sun went down, and who knows, maybe we could have some fish tacos for the night. The girls agreed and said that they would finish making camp while I was off. We split a 3-person tent, so it was pretty easy. Anyway, as I went down toward the small river in the meadow, there was a large rock near where we were camping, and it was about the size of, I would say, a 2-car garage, and about that tall as well. Large enough that you definitely couldn't see over it. Now, when I passed it, I noticed a young man walking around it in my direction. I was surprised by that because by this time most people are already getting camp ready, as it gets pretty cold and dark fast in this Sierra. I was also a bit confused on where the heck that he'd even come from, as he was not on the trail. He was just sort of walking straight through a meadow with a river running through it, away from any trail. As he got closer, I noticed that he was only wearing a small day pack, blue running shorts, and a white t-shirt, all completely clean. That may not sound that strange, but when you're multiple days away from any trailhead that leads out of the mountain, it definitely is a bit strange. I was kind of walking away from him toward the river, but it seemed like he was following me, so I stopped and said, "Hey man, how's it going?" He replied, "Hello," in a very plain and sort of monotone voice. He then said to me in the same voice, "What are you doing?" I replied, "Well, I'm about to go fishing," as if it wasn't obvious that I have a rod and a reel in my hand. He didn't laugh though. As he kept following, he said, "What will you do with the fish?" I said, "If it's big enough and not pregnant, I'm going to eat it." At this point, I stopped by a little beach on the side of the river, and he passed by me, and I felt a bit of relief. He seemed a bit off to me, I guess, but then, just when he was about 20 feet past me, he stopped and turned around along the beach and squatted down and just watched me fishing. Eventually, I pulled one in, and it was a pretty good size, and I prepared to clean it, and just as I pulled the guts out of the fish, he said, "How does it taste?" And I looked over at him, waiting to hear a joke or something, and he was just smiling. A terrible feeling suddenly came over me, like that hair on the back of your neck type of feeling, just standing up. I said, "Well, I have to clean it first, man, and cook it and all." I said it in a way that would have come off to normal people as, "Okay, I'm done talking to you, it's time to go" type of way. I stuck my knife in the sand in front of me, and I didn't put it away this time. The man, after a while, said, "I'm hiking 30 miles today." And I said, "That's nice, man, have fun." And he just stood up and walked off into the meadow towards a tree line, not on or near any trail, and just sort of vanished into the woods. I went back to camp, and I didn't really say anything to the girls because I didn't want to scare them. The night came in and we ate and we went to bed, and honestly, I mostly forgot about it. But then I wake up. Well, actually, I felt woken up is probably a better way to say it. I noticed both girls sitting up, and my wife said, "There's something there." I was so tired that I just said, "No, there isn't. Go back to bed, guys." I laid down, and so did the girls, and within seconds heard a very fast shuffling sound, and immediately I sat up, and so did the girls. I said, "Oh yeah, there's definitely something there." So I use a sort of small foam sitting mat outside of my inner tent in the vestibule for shoes at night and to sit on during the day. And I saw it moving, and could even feel it moving, which meant that something was literally right outside of my tent. I grabbed my headlamp and our bear spray, and with my heart exploding out of my chest, I zipped open the tent ready to battle whatever was out there. But when I did, there was nothing. Not even a distant sound. It was dead silent. Like ear-ringing silent, in fact. Maybe a squirrel or something? Or maybe that buck that I saw earlier? I said. We laid down, and this ended up happening like 7 more times. And every time that I went out, there was nothing. Eventually, I started to actually pass out because of just how exhausted I was, and I only really remember cursing at it as I fell asleep. I woke up again and looked over, and both my wife and friend were asleep. I heard the sound again, and I got ready with my bear spray and worked up my courage once more. I zipped open the tent, and there he was, about 15 feet away. The same guy on all fours in an almost push-up-like position, staring directly at me with that same face. It was completely silent, and then he crawled backwards into the dark with a speed that it's hard to explain. Then, all I remember is that I woke up. I was so relieved that it was a dream, and in the morning I told them that I had dreamed that there was something at the tent, and they looked at me like I was joking. Our friend said, "Yeah, that wasn't a dream." My heart sank. I said, "Well, what about the guy?" And they said, "What guy?" Obviously, I didn't tell them about the guy down at the river, so they couldn't know if it was real or not, or just a dream that he had visited the tent. But they also recalled not understanding why they fell asleep so fast when something was outside, and they felt like there was a sort of blank in their memory before falling to sleep, which is a bit weird. We all agreed that there was a general feeling that was off in this place. I don't really tell people this story too because I know how crazy it sounds, that it sounds stupid and fake. It even sounds that way to myself when I talk about it. But I do know one thing. I will never be sleeping in that meadow ever again. My house was haunted ever since it was built, and so I theorized that it wasn't the house, but instead that it was the land. It was a pretty big property, around 40,000 square feet, and around it were just fields. In the radius of around 1 kilometer, there was no population there either. There were about maybe 6 to 7 people who worked on our property full-time to maintain it, and every single one of them had a story to tell, let me tell you. So, when the house was being built, construction workers used to see this weird animal who looked like a rabbit. When they went to catch it though, it would turn into a rapper and fly away into the air and just sort of vanish. Yes, that's how they described it, like a rapper. That animal would suddenly turn into an object though, and it would just vanish. This story as well had been told to me about 3 different times by 3 different people over the years, all of them not knowing each other. When me and my siblings were little, my mother used to hear jingling of anklets at night. My father was always away on business trips, and helpers were not allowed inside the residential properties, so we used to be alone. Which means that there was nobody inside the house, and the jingling sounds and the sounds of people running around in the lounge were always heard. Things took a major turn though when we grew a bit older. Like one time a maid suddenly came over to my mother and asked her, "Yes ma'am, what is it?" My mother gave her a very confused look and she said to her, "You called for me," but my mother never did. She then said, "You were standing on the stairs staring at me, and when I asked, 'Do you want anything, ma'am?' you just gestured to me with your hand to come to you. I completed my work and so I'm here." When my mother told her that nobody had called her and that I was in my room the whole time, her face literally turned pale. Another time I was alone in my room and I heard a door opening and then closing. Imagine those door closers that have the door closer on them and they are made of wood. They make a big sound when they're closed. I hope you know what I'm talking about, but when I heard it, I went downstairs to check and the door was closed and everything was normal. I thought that maybe it was the air or something, which is a bit sus because air cannot open a wooden door, but that was just me coping, I guess. I closed all the windows shut so that there was no air coming from anywhere and I went back up. And the moment that I was on my last step, I again heard that sound of the door opening and then closing. And it was now that I was beginning to realize that this might be some sort of jinn or demonic type thing. I just stood there for like a minute, but again I went downstairs anyway. I was in the middle of the stairs and I saw that the door was just hanging in between, like not closed and not open either. That was impossible, as that door had a door closer on it, and who the heck opened it? All the other doors and the windows were locked too, and there was no humans around apart from myself, and also definitely no air anymore. So I just sort of stood there a bit frozen, taken aback. I looked at the door for like 5 seconds, and then it closed itself suddenly with a huge bang, like a person just slammed the door. Well, that was enough for me. I ran upstairs and increased the volume of the TV so that I wouldn't hear it any longer, and just tried to ignore it. On another occasion, I was awoken by a large banging sound, like somebody was banging on the door very hard. The sound was coming from the lounge, which was a bit far from my room, but it was around 2 or 3 in the morning maybe, and I went to check it out. I was genuinely surprised too that nobody else was awake or seemed to be hearing this. I mean, the sound was very loud, but I tried not to think about it too much, thinking that they must just be in a deep sleep. When I reached the door though, I was completely in shock. The sound was coming from behind the door, as if somebody was banging on it, but as loud as the sound was, the door wasn't vibrating or moving or anything. It was still. Again, I stood there thinking, what the heck is happening? I was convinced that it was a thief at first or something, so I peeked through the window that was beside the door, and there was no one and nothing there. The sound was still coming, but there was no one behind the door, and it was a really, really strange experience. But as I told you, we were experiencing these things since even childhood, so I just turned and I went back to my room to go to sleep. There was also this one thing too that used to happen pretty regularly as well. Whenever one of us was sleeping alone in a room at night, we used to always feel as if something was pulling the toe on our feet. I swear as well that this happened so many times that I just eventually lost count. Another thing that usually happened to my mother, though, was that she was slapped on her leg. Even if we were in the room, she would just sort of wake up and angrily ask, "Did you just slap me?" I would always sit there clueless as to what she was talking about, and then we would both give each other that knowing look and just sort of go back to sleep or go back to our work or whatever. And the most strange part is that I used to get these dreams about strange types of darkness lingering in our house. One could say that my mind was just playing tricks on me, but hear me out first. So one time I had a dream that there were a bunch of children between the ages of 3 to 6 sitting on our lawn eating raw meat. The kids' clothes and bodies were very dirty, and they were just devouring the meat that they had in their hands. I woke up feeling a bit weird, but I didn't say anything. I went to the lawn to get some fresh air, and I saw that there was a trash bag there, randomly just sort of seemingly placed there. I didn't give it too much thought, and I went back to the main lounge to eat some breakfast. Now, as I was eating, my mother came to me looking a bit uncomfortable, I guess, and told me that when she woke up, she found a cluster of meat on our lawn. Like, take a bunch of meat and press it tightly together, that's what this looked like. That's when I told her about my dream, and both of us just sort of sat there, speechless, really. Anyway, this is getting pretty long, so I'll leave it there for now, but I lived in that house for 13 years before eventually moving to another city, and upon moving, nothing else has ever happened. I was 22 years old when this happened. So I worked in a grocery store which had been featured in the news. You could see me in the clip and it was clear where I worked. I had just came back from vacation and a co-worker told me that some guy had been coming around every day for a week asking for me. When I asked who or why, they told me that they had no idea, but he was around my age and seemed a little bit off to them. Well, a few hours passed by and my co-worker came and told me that the guy was back again, asking for me. His name was James. In the back room, we had a computer, and you could see all the camera footage from all over the place. I looked and didn't recognize who James was, but decided to go and ask what he wanted anyway. When I went to meet him, he was clearly drunk and said that he had seen me on TV and wanted to ask me out. I replied with, I'm sorry, but I'm actually in a relationship, even though I was single. I said that I needed to get back to work, and he asked me if he should come with me or not. I was confused by this and said that I'm working. He then left, but I could see him through the cameras outside the store, just drinking. A few hours passed by, and he was still waiting for me outside, so I had to use another exit when I left. The next day, I came to work, and I saw him waiting for me outside the store. He had a huge smile on his face, and he immediately walked up to me. He was really shy and didn't say a word until I said, "Hey," while passing by to get into the store. He followed me inside and said that he needed to talk. I asked him what was up, and he said, "How about we go to the movies?" He was really creepy, and I replied, "Look, I'm sorry, I have a boyfriend, remember?" As I was walking away, he started following me and asked if he could come help me with my work. "No thanks," I replied. Once again, I looked at the camera footage, and yet again he was waiting for me outside. At this point, I started asking a male co-worker to escort me safely to my tram every night when my shift ended. I started getting really scared once this had been going on for a while, and he clearly wouldn't leave me alone. I asked my brother if he could drive me to work on his motorcycle and hug me outside of my workplace, so it looked like he was my boyfriend, and James would maybe leave me alone finally, since I knew that he was somewhere watching and waiting for me to get to work. It didn't help though. I started getting these messages like, "Is that your boyfriend? And he doesn't need to know if we go out, you know." I was confused about how he had even gotten my number in the first place. I asked all of my co-workers, and a new one said that she'd apparently given my number because he had said that he is a friend of mine. I was angry about that. At this point, I asked my male co-workers to throw him out if he ever came back, which was a lot. A couple of weeks went by without any harassment, and I finally thought that he had left me alone. Boy, was I wrong. I came to work one day and was in the changing room and heard that we have a new co-worker and that it's his first day. I didn't think anything of it and proceeded to change my clothes. Once I got out of my changing room, my jaw literally hit the floor. Another co-worker said, "Hey, this is James." I looked in horror as she asked me what was wrong. I said, "I know, this creep has been the one stalking me for weeks," as James smiled. I went and searched for my boss to ask him what the heck. My boss said that he had no idea that this was my stalker and kind of laughed it off as no big deal. I told him that either he leaves or I will. He said that I wouldn't have to work the same shift as James and he couldn't fire him. He lied though. You see, I had a lot of shifts with him, and wherever I went, he followed without saying a word. He just kept following me. I would often have my lunch break by the computer so that I could at least see where he was, and every day I could see him just staring at me behind me as I ate. We had cameras there too. This went on for a while. He would text me every day, but at work he didn't say anything, just stared at me. My boss finally understood though what a freak James was and that he didn't actually do any work, just stalking, and started to think of ideas of how to fire him. One time I noticed James was clearly drunk at work, and so I told my boss and he got fired. And this is when the stalking, well, as far as I know, finally stopped. This is my account of the only real scary occurrence that I've had in my life. It was mid-October, 1992. I was riding home on my motorcycle from seeing some friends. It was late in the evening, early morning hours of that chilly fall weekend in Central California. I had made my turn off of the county freeway onto a less than well-lit country road. I remember that the road ahead was deserted, no headlights coming towards me, nor any taillights in my rearview mirrors. The road was encompassed, though, with large walnut groves on each side. The huge trees and the land swallowed the distance ahead in complete darkness. I was clipping along at about maybe 50 miles per hour when my eyes caught the jogger up ahead of me, on my right side. My mind quickly thought, how odd, wondering why someone would be out here jogging at this time of the year, at this hour of the night. As I approached him, I gradually moved to the middle of the road to give the jogger some space. I touched on my brights so that he could see me approaching. Now, understand this. At first, in my mind, there was nothing out of the ordinary, other than the timing of the situation. A hooded runner, heather grey sweats, a figure about 6 feet tall, jogging along the shoulder of a deserted country road at midnight in October. A bit strange, yeah, but really, who am I to judge? Anyway, as I approached him at a safe distance of maybe 100 feet away, bright headlight blazing, I saw him. Or perhaps I should say, it stumbled. I fully expected the figure to fall, sprawling face down into the plowed dirt, but it didn't. It fell to the ground on all fours, but very quickly and with amazing agility, it began running like an animal on all fours, like a wild animal. Mind you, I was riding at a regular speed at this point, maybe 55 miles per hour, but the hooded human form that I'd watched become a hooded animal was keeping pace with me for a moment. Then, as if it sensed that it had been discovered, it sped off to its right into the pitch-black walnut grove. Instantly, my blood ran cold. I downshifted out of instinct and throttled hard, and honestly, I was gone. All I could think of at that split second was that thing, that animal, might suddenly pop up in my rearview mirror with some horrific, maniacal, grimaced face right before ending me. Before I knew it, I was driving 5 miles down the road and my speedometer read 100 miles per hour. And just before I made my final right turn towards home, I got my courage up to look into my rearview, but there was nothing. There was just the pitch-black night behind me. Whatever it was now gone. Shakingly, I made my last turn, and I didn't look back again until I pulled into my garage and I closed the door. To this day, now 30 years later, I can tell this story, and my listeners will react with either complete disbelief, some believe me, and others are not sure. But what really was it? A person, an animal, a shapeshifter, a skinwalker or something? Or maybe a combination of all those? I'll let you decide for yourself. This was on the last day of June 30th to be exact. My stepdad worked at a motorcycle shop next to the Native American res that we were nearby. This particular day, me and my mum had to go and help him at work because they were moving to a different building to somewhere about a mile away. My stepdad told me a story about something that had happened there one time, paranormal-wise, and I've always believed in the paranormal, so I was sort of curious, I guess. Ever since I was little, I've heard voices and stuff, seen things that weren't really there, or things would fly across my room and stuff like that. So my stepdad had told me that one time he was there, he was exhausted from the summer heat and had been working all day. He was feeling a little bit vulnerable, according to his words. That's when demons come out to get you. And he said that He was talking to my mum, and the next thing that he knew, he was leaving the building. But what had happened was he had actually choked my mum out, almost killed her in fact. She had a broken nose, choke marks, and honestly, I've known this man for a long time, and this is just completely unlike him. My stepdad was never scrawny, like at all, but he was maybe about 160 pounds, 5'8"-ish. My mum was like 5'11" and 245 pounds. Two other people saw this happen, and they both attested to the fact that his eyes went completely black, and his whole demeanor just suddenly changed. He eventually overpowered whatever this thing was and dropped her, leaving the place on his motorcycle immediately. And once he crossed the bridge away from the Native American res, he had to pull to the corner because he felt really sick and puked up this like black goo, as he described it. He went over to the cop that was at the other corner and asked if he had seen him, and the cop said no, he never even heard the motorcycle. So, that's my dad's story, but this night it was my turn to have an experience that secured my belief in the incident that happened and in the paranormal. So the night was normal. It was about 9 p.m. and I was going to Walmart, a little bit away with my mum to get some food since everybody was hungry. We got to said Walmart, but we actually had the dog in the car with us, and so my mum decided to stay in the car with him while I went in with her phone to get some groceries. I went into the store and obviously I'm looking for the stuff. I was about to call my stepdad on my mum's phone. I didn't have a phone at the time since I wasn't old enough yet, and call my stepdad to see what kind of flavor of yogurt that he wanted. But he called me, and I answered the phone and I hear, "Hi," and I said, "Hey, good thing you called me. I was just about to call to see what kind of yogurt," and was cut off by "hi, hi, hi" over and over again. I was like, "Hello?" And all I got was "hey" and "hi." And then the phone just hung up. That was a bit weird, and definitely freaked me out a bit. I called him back and was like, "What did you do that for?" And he was like, "What? What do you need? I was on the phone with my boss." And my heart instantly sank. I told him what happened, and he told me not to worry, but I was worried. He said to get whatever I had to, so I hurried and got the food and I left. I went out and told my mum what happened, and she said to just ignore it too. I was getting in the car and we were about to leave, and a message came through on her phone. "What's your name, little one?" with a bunch of scribble and random numbers and signs and things. I then said, "What the heck?" and I started saying, "Stop, Dad, this isn't funny." We got there and I confronted him, and he said that he didn't know what I was even talking about, and he just sort of blew it off again. Me and my mum were going into his room to unstock the shelves of all the nuts and the bolts and screws and tape and all that sort of small stuff, but the lighting in this room was insanely bright and the music was louder in there than all the others. It was too much for me for a bit, and I got really nauseous all of a sudden. My mum was directing me to leave. As I said, she's like 5'11", and I was about 5'3"-ish at the time, so she's a little bit taller, but she had her arm over my shoulder and opening the door, and as I turned, I saw an almost 6-foot black shadow figure of a man, and I hear, "Get out." And me and my mum, we instantly ran. I felt really sick all of a sudden, and it was hard to breathe, and it was hot as heck outside. But we ran and told my dad, and even he looked a little bit scared. I was absolutely terrified by all of this. Me and my mum and dad all had to go lock up the merch room, and I was the one who had to go unlock the door. And I felt sick, but my stepdad and mum were too chicken to do it, so I had to. I went over and was locking the door, and I hear Joe in an almost little girl sing-song voice, and I instantly froze. I looked back, and so did my mother and stepdad, and my mum goes, "It just called his name," and we all instantly ran together. My stepdad had this look on his face, and he looked like he was about to puke as well. We got out of there though, and I refused to go back there ever since. More stuff happened, little stuff, like my parents kept hearing their names being called, all kind of stuff. Eventually we left, and I will never be going back there ever again. By the way, if you've ever seen a Native American bent marking tree, they're trees that are tied to rope when they're growing, so that they have a bend near the base, and there was one actually outside of this place. About a year or two later, me and my mum and my stepdad all went on vacation. We went up north, and up there was this supposed haunted mansion, and it was definitely a little bit eerie seeing one of those bent trees there as well. Also, that place was also very haunted. It had Native American print on the windows, and the people who lived there were friends with Native Americans. Also, there was a Native American pottery thing going on there as well. It's called the Riordan Mansion. If you go on tour there, you have to get told all the dark history and all that, but when I went there, I swear that I could feel and sort of sense that something had happened there. I'll perhaps write another post about that some other time, but anyway, this is what happened at my dad's workshop, and I'm super glad that we never have to go back there ever again. I don't know what is completely relevant to this story, so I'm just going to try to be as detailed as possible. So several years ago, when I was still a student, I witnessed something strange. It was 4 a.m. and I had just left my dorm room to wake a friend up in another dorm block. On normal days, we'd wake up at like 5 a.m., but we had exams coming up, so that's why I woke up an hour earlier. I had a quick shower and walked over to pick up my friend from her dorm. Now, we didn't have any streetlights on our campus, and we were far from the closest town, like 5 kilometers at least. So the area was pretty dark, with exceptions of the lights emanating from the individual dorm building entrances. Her dorm was around a 3-minute walk, and between her dorm and mine, there wasn't much but a path lined up by a short hedge and some trees here and there, really. Now, around a minute away from her dorm room, now in view, I saw something. A bright, blinding ball of light, roughly the size of a volleyball, shot from behind me. I instantly froze. I felt like this thing was watching me. It made no sound at all, and somehow it didn't illuminate the area around it as much for the amount of light that it was producing. It stayed motionless, around 1.5 meters above and in front of me. I remember standing there and wondering what on earth that was. I was frozen, and I had this terrible sense of dread, and I felt paralyzed. I remember telling myself to look away and to just run, but before I could do anything, it kind of just started hovering around, and then zapped away so fast that I felt like if I had blinked that I would have thought that it just disappeared. Suddenly, I wasn't so scared anymore, so I looked around behind the tree to see if I could still spot it, but it was gone. I bolted to my friend's dorm, but by the time that I had got there, some people were already awake, and what was supposed to be a 3-minute walk had now been around 25 to 30 minutes.